Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was late, and the rain hadn't let up for hours. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. I was driving back from my sister's place, a good 2-hour drive from where I lived. I'd left later than I'd planned, and now it was almost midnight. The rain was coming down so hard that the wipers barely kept up, smearing water across the windshield more than clearing it. I was already tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to focus on the slick road ahead. I saw him just past the bend in the road. At first, it was just a blur, a figure standing on the shoulder, hunched against the rain. As I got closer, my headlights lit him up. He was soaked to the bone, wearing a dark jacket that clung to his frame, water dripping from his hair and face. His arm shot out, thumb extended, the universal signal for a hitchhiker. I don't know why I slowed down. Maybe it was the rain, or the fact that he looked miserable standing there in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was guilt, thinking how I'd feel if I were stranded out here in weather like this. Either way, I pulled over. He jogged up to the car, water splashing around his boots. When I rolled down the window, he bent down, and I got my first good look at him. He looked to be in his late 30s, early 40s maybe. His face was pale, water streaming down his cheeks. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice low but strained. "I've been out here for hours. You're a lifesaver." I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. He climbed in quickly, shaking off the rain as best he could, though it didn't help much. The smell of wet clothes filled the car immediately. He shivered as he buckled himself in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just up the road," he said, pointing vaguely ahead. "Not far." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. The rain hammered against the roof, and the sound of the wipers filled the silence between us. I tried not to stare at him, but I couldn't help glancing over every few seconds. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted slightly down. His jacket was zipped up tight, but something about the way he held himself made me uneasy. "You, got stuck out here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Car broke down," he said quickly. "Back there a ways." "Did you call someone?" He shook his head. "Phone's dead." I didn't push it. Something about his tone made me want to drop the subject. Instead, I focused on the road, though my grip on the wheel tightened. The minutes stretched on, and the tension in the car grew. He didn't say much, just stared straight ahead. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that he was just cold and tired. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way he sat, too still. The way his eyes darted to the rearview mirror every so often, like he was checking for something or someone. After a while, he shifted in his seat. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye and glanced over. That's when I saw it, a handle sticking out from inside his jacket. At first, I thought maybe it was a tool, a flashlight or something. But then he adjusted his jacket, and I saw the glint of metal. A knife. A long one. My stomach dropped. I kept my face as neutral as I could, but inside, my mind was racing. Why was he carrying a knife? And why was he trying to hide it? I forced myself to stay calm, my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't want him to know I'd seen it. "So, I said, keeping my tone light. How far did you say you needed to go? Just a bit further, he said, his voice low. I'll tell you where to stop. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a plan, but I couldn't think straight. The rain was still coming down hard, the road stretching endlessly ahead. There wasn't another car in sight. I couldn't pull over, not with him sitting there, the knife hidden in his jacket. I couldn't speed up or swerve, he'd notice. Then he spoke again, and his voice sent a chill down my spine. You live around here? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. No, I lied quickly. Just passing through. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. You seem like a nice guy, he said. Not many people would stop for a stranger these days. I didn't respond. My throat felt dry, my pulse thundering in my ears. I focused on the road, hoping, praying for a sign of another car, a gas station, anything. But the road was dark and empty, just the endless rain and the shadows of trees on either side. He shifted again, and I felt the air in the car grow heavier. You ever wonder, he said suddenly, what you'd do if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time? The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence stretched on, and I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just keep driving, waiting for him to make a move. I glanced at the dashboard, pretending to check the fuel gauge. Damn, I muttered, loud enough for him to hear. I think I'm running low on gas. I might need to pull over soon. He didn't respond right away. When I glanced over, his eyes were on me, unblinking. There's a station up ahead, he said finally. Keep going. I nodded, my grip tightening on the wheel. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. If I could get to the station, maybe there'd be people there. Or at least a chance to get out of the car. But then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught, my knuckles white on the wheel. But instead of pulling out the knife, he pulled out a phone. He held it up, tapping the screen a few times. The glow lit up his face, casting shadows across his sharp features. You said your phone was dead, I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Guess I lied, he said. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I hit the brakes hard, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, but I didn't answer. As soon as the car stopped, I threw it into park and bolted up the door, rain pouring down on me as I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran, the rain soaking through my clothes, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. I heard him shout behind me, the car door slamming, but I didn't dare turn around. I ran until I saw headlights in the distance, waving my arms frantically as a truck approached. The driver stopped, and I stumbled toward him, gasping for breath. Help, I managed to say. Someone's after me. The truck driver didn't ask questions. He let me climb in, and we sped off, leaving the car and the hitchhiker behind. I don't know what he wanted or what he planned to do, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. The rain had been steady all day, but by the time we left my parents' house that evening, it had turned into a downpour. The kind of rain where even the I-beams don't cut through, and the sound of it on the roof makes it hard to think. We were late getting on the road, and I was in a hurry to get home. Emily, my wife, kept looking out the window, biting her lip every time the car splashed through a deep puddle. "You sure this is the fastest way?" she asked. "It's a shortcut," I said. "Shaves off 20 minutes, easy." We were in the middle of nowhere, cutting through the back roads to avoid the highway traffic. The GPS didn't even register the route. It was just one of those things I remembered from years back when I'd driven this way before. The road was narrow, flanked by thick trees on both sides, and with the rain, it felt like we were driving through a tunnel. Emily didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. I wished she had. The first sign of trouble was the water running across the road. It wasn't too deep at first, just enough to make me slow down. The rain made it hard to tell how much worse it was ahead. I told myself it was fine. The car could handle it. We kept going. A few miles in, the water got deeper. It was up to the tires now, and I could feel the car struggling. Emily was gripping the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. "Maybe we should turn around," she said. I didn't answer right away. Part of me didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake. Turning around meant admitting defeat, and besides, the thought of going back through all that water didn't seem any better. "We're almost through," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The road dipped suddenly, and that's when we hit it, a stretch of water that looked more like a river. I slammed on the brakes, but the car slid a little before stopping. The water was flowing fast, rippling and churning under the beams of the headlights. It wasn't just a puddle. It was a flood. Emily started to panic. "We can't drive through that," she said. "It's too deep." "I know," I said, trying to sound calm. "We'll turn around." I put the car in reverse, but the tires spun uselessly. The back end shifted slightly, and I realized with a sick feeling that the water was pulling us. It wasn't deep enough to submerge us, not yet, but it was enough to make the car unsteady. I tried again, pressing harder on the gas, but it was no use. "We're stuck," Emily said, her voice shaking. The rain kept pounding, and the water was rising. It was already lapping at the bottom of the doors. I turned off the engine, trying to think. We couldn't stay in the car, not with the water climbing. But getting out didn't seem like a great option either. The road was pitch black, and the trees on either side looked like walls. There was no way to tell how far we'd have to walk to find help, or if we'd even make it through the water. "Do you see any houses?" I asked, squinting through the rain. Emily shook her head. "I can't see anything." I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were too far out in the sticks. Emily tried hers too, but it was the same. No bars, no hope of calling for help. We were on our own. "Stay here," I said. "I'm going to check how deep it is." "No!" Emily grabbed my arm. "Don't get out. What if it's worse than it looks?" "We can't just sit here," I said. "If the water gets into the engine, we're screwed." She didn't let go right away, but eventually she nodded. I opened the door, and the cold hit me like a slap. The water rushed in immediately, soaking my shoes and socks. It was up to my shins already. I stepped out, testing the ground. The current was stronger than I expected, pushing against my legs as I waded forward. I kept one hand on the car, feeling my way. That's when I saw it, something moving in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but then it moved again. A shadow, slipping between the trunks. I froze. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. No answer. Just the sound of water and wind. I turned back toward the car, my heart pounding. "Emily, lock the doors," I said, climbing back in. My clothes were soaked, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "What is it?" she asked. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I saw someone." Her eyes widened, and she locked the doors without another word. We sat there, listening to the rain and the water sloshing against the car. Every so often, I thought I heard something else, something faint, like footsteps splashing through the water. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. "We can't stay here," Emily said finally. "The water's getting higher." She was right. It was up to the doors now, and the car felt like it was shifting slightly, the current pulling harder. I knew we had to move, but the thought of stepping out into that darkness, with whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen out there, made my stomach turn. Then we saw the light. It was faint at first, a small glow in the distance. At first, I thought it might be a car coming from the other direction, but it didn't move like headlights. It bobbed slightly, like someone was carrying it. A flashlight. "Hey!" I shouted, rolling down the window. "Over here." The light stopped for a moment, then started moving toward us. I felt a surge of relief. Help was coming. But as the figure got closer, something didn't feel right. The way they moved, slow and deliberate, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person in a long coat, the flashlight held low. When they reached the car, they didn't say anything. They just stood there, the beam of the flashlight aimed at the water. I rolled the window down further, leaning out. "Hey, can you help us? We're stuck." The figure tilted their head slightly, like they were studying me. Then, without a word, they reached into their coat. I didn't wait to see what they were pulling out. "Get down," I shouted to Emily, slamming the window shut and throwing the car into gear. The tires screamed against the wet road, but finally they caught and the car lurched backward out of the deeper water. The figure didn't chase us. They just stood there, the flashlight beam following us as we reversed. I didn't stop until we were back on higher ground, the water no longer pulling at the car. We didn't see anyone else for the rest of the drive. When we finally made it home, soaked and shaken, I couldn't stop thinking about the person in the coat. About what they might have been planning. About how close we'd come to finding out. The rain started as I left work, a steady drizzle that turned into a downpour by the time I was halfway home. It wasn't unusual for the old highway to flood in spots, but I'd never had trouble before. I was in the middle of nowhere, no streetlights, no signs of life, just dark trees on both sides of the road. The sound of the rain on the roof was loud, like it was trying to drown out everything else. My car started acting up about 10 miles past the last town. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. I pulled over to the shoulder, trying not to panic. I turned the key again, but it just clicked. The rain kept pouring, and I could see the water pooling on the road. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The screen just showed no service in the corner. I thought about walking, but I didn't even know where the next town was, and I wasn't dressed for the rain. I decided to wait it out. Maybe someone would come by. It was late, but this highway wasn't completely deserted, at least, that's what I told myself. After about 20 minutes, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me as the vehicle slowed and pulled up behind me. It was an old pickup truck, the kind with a rusty bumper and dents along the side. A man got out, his hood pulled up against the rain. He walked toward my car, waving. I rolled down the window just a little, enough to hear him but not enough to let the rain in. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice loud over the storm. Yeah, it just died on me, I said. I think it's the battery or something. He leaned down to look inside. His face was hard to see under the hood, but he had a beard and a kind of rough look about him. Pop the hood, he said. I'll take a look. Something about him made me hesitate, but I didn't have many options. I reached down and pulled the lever. He walked around to the front of the car, and I could hear him fiddling with the latch. After a minute, he called out, "Yeah, looks like your alternator's shot. You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "Can I call a tow truck?" I asked, holding up my phone. "I don't have service out here." He shook his head. "You won't get any this far out. Closest town's about 15 miles back. I can give you a ride if you want." There it was, the thing I'd been dreading. I didn't want to get in his truck. Something about him didn't sit right with me. But what was the alternative? Stay here all night? Walk in the rain? "Thanks, but I think I'll wait," I said, trying to sound polite. "Someone else might come by." He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me through the rain. "Not many people take this road," he said. "Could be hours before someone else shows up. Maybe longer." "I'll take my chances," I said, a little firmer this time. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he closed the hood and walked back toward his truck. I thought that was the end of it, but instead of getting in, he stood by his driver's side door, watching me. I tried not to look, but I could feel his eyes on me. I locked the doors, my heart pounding. He stayed there for what felt like forever, just staring. Finally, he got in his truck and started it up. I breathed a sigh of relief as the headlights swept over my car, and the truck pulled back onto the road. But then, instead of driving away, he stopped about 50 feet ahead. The brake lights glowed red in the rain. He was just sitting there, waiting. My hands were shaking as I tried the ignition again, but the car was still dead. I kept my eyes on the truck, praying he would leave. But he didn't. The driver's side door opened, and he stepped out. This time, he wasn't trying to be friendly. He walked toward my car, his strides deliberate, his shoulders hunched against the rain. My mind was racing. What did he want? Why hadn't he just left? I rolled up the window completely and grabbed my phone again, even though I knew it was useless. He reached my car and banged on the driver's side window, hard enough to make me jump. "Open the door," he shouted. "You're not safe out here." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I'm fine. Please leave." His face twisted, and he pounded on the glass again. "You think you're fine?" he yelled. "You're not. Open the damn door." I screamed, backing away as far as I could. He stepped back and looked around, like he was checking to see if anyone else was coming. Then he moved toward the front of my car again. I couldn't see what he was doing, but I heard a loud metallic clank, and the car shifted slightly. He was messing with something under the hood. That's when I saw another pair of headlights coming down the road. Another car was approaching, its beams cutting through the rain. The man froze, then slammed the hood shut and ran back to his truck. He peeled out, the tires splashing water as he sped away. The second car pulled up beside me, and a woman rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" she asked. I saw him run off. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. "My car's dead," I said. "I don't know what to do." "Get in," she said. "I'll take you to the next town." I hesitated, but she looked sincere, and I didn't want to be alone if that man came back. I grabbed my bag and climbed into our car, my clothes soaking the seat. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his truck again. but he was gone. When we reached the town, I called a tow truck and the police. They found my car later that night. The alternator wasn't just dead, it had been tampered with. Whatever the man had done under the hood had made sure I wouldn't be driving anywhere. I still don't know what he wanted, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. The rain had started before I left the office, but I didn't think much of it. By the time I was halfway home, it was coming down in sheets, so heavy my wipers couldn't keep up. It was one of those back roads, winding and narrow, with no lights except for my own headlights cutting through the dark. I was going slower than usual, but the pavement was slick and the turns were sharp. I don't even remember what I hit. It could have been a branch or a patch of water pooling on the curve. My tires slid, and before I knew it, I was skidding off the road. The car slammed into something, maybe a tree, and came to a stop. My chest hurt from the seatbelt digging in, but I wasn't bleeding. I tried the engine, but it just sputtered. Dead. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was gone. It was too far out, too isolated. The rain was coming down so hard that staying in the car felt useless. I had seen a house just a little way back. I figured I could at least ask to use their phone. Leaving my car felt wrong, but what else could I do? I put up my hood and stepped out, the rain soaking through my shoes almost immediately. The house wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile at most. It was big, an old farmhouse kind of place, sitting back from the road with a long gravel driveway. The lights were on inside, which made me think someone would help. I jogged up to the porch, trying to shake off the water before I knocked on the door. I waited, shivering. The rain made everything sound muffled, like the world had shrunk to just me in this house. No one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. A light flicked on upstairs, and I saw a shadow move behind the curtains. Someone was home. I knocked again and called out, "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down. I just need help." After a few seconds, I heard the lock turn, and the door opened just a crack. A man stood there, older, maybe in his late 60s, with thin hair and a lined face. He was holding the door with one hand, and the other was hidden behind it. His eyes were sharp, watching me closely. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. "My car's stuck down the road," I said. "It won't start, and I don't have a signal. I just need to use your phone, if that's okay." He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked me up and down. Then he nodded and opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the house smelled old, like wood and dust. The hallway was narrow, with faded wallpaper and a single bulb overhead casting long shadows. The man didn't speak as he shut the door behind me, and I noticed he slid the bolt across once it was closed. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just an old habit. "The phone's in the kitchen," he said, motioning down the hall. "You can use it." "Thank you," I said, trying to sound grateful. I followed him down the hall, my wet shoes squeaking on the floor. The kitchen was small, with a table in the corner and an old rotary phone mounted on the wall. I picked it up and listened for a dial tone, but there was nothing. "It's dead," I said, turning back to him. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "Storm must have knocked it out," he said. "Happens a lot out here." I didn't know what to say. I was stuck now, completely at his mercy. "Do you have a cell phone?" I asked, hoping he might have something newer. "Don't use them," he said flatly. "But you're welcome to wait here until the rain lets up." Maybe the phone will come back. I didn't have much choice, so I nodded. Thank you, I said again. He motioned to the table. Sit. I'll get you something warm. I sat down, the chair creaking under me. He moved to the stove, where a kettle was already sitting. I tried not to stare, but something about the way he moved felt off, like he was too deliberate, too careful. His hand shook a little as he poured the water, but his face stayed calm, almost blank. When he set the mug in front of me, I noticed his hand lingered on the edge of the table, just for a second. I looked down and saw faint scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged a knife across it over and over. My stomach tightened. You live here alone? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded. Been here all my life. Don't get many visitors. I sipped the tea, even though I wasn't thirsty. It was bitter, and I wondered if he'd added something to it. The thought made me feel stupid, paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. He was just standing there, watching me, not drinking anything himself. I should probably get back to my car, I said, setting the mug down. Maybe someone else will come by. His face hardened. You'll stay, he said. It's too dangerous out there. I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I'll be fine, I said, standing up. Really, thank you for your help, but I don't want to bother you anymore. He stepped in front of me, blocking the door. You can't leave, he said, his voice colder now. Not yet. I glanced past him, toward the hallway. My heart was pounding. Why not? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp, and he held it like he knew how to use it. Sit down, he said. I backed up, my mind racing. The window over the sink was small, but I thought I could fit through it if I had to. The rain was still pounding outside, and the glass was fogged up, but it was better than staying. I don't want trouble, I said. I just want to leave. He shook his head slowly. You shouldn't have come here. Before he could move, I grabbed the mug from the table and threw the hot tea at him. He screamed, clutching his face, and I bolted for the window. The latch was stiff, but I forced it open and scrambled through, landing hard in the mud outside. I ran, not looking back, slipping and stumbling in the rain. I could hear him shouting, but his voice faded as I put more distance between us. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept going until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, desperate, and the car slowed. A woman rolled down her window, looking concerned. Are you okay? She asked. Please, I said, breathless. I need help. There's a man back there, he has a knife. She unlocked the door, and I climbed in, shaking and soaked. She called the police as we drove away. I told them everything, but when they went to the house, it was empty. No sign of a man, no sign of anyone. I don't know where he went, but I still think about that night. About what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out. It started as just a way to clear my head. I had a long day, and the rain was light enough to make running feel refreshing. I liked the sound of it, the way it drowned out everything else. The trail I usually took was quieter in weather like this, and I thought I'd have it all to myself. The park was mostly empty when I arrived. I remember seeing only one other car in the lot, an old sedan with muddy tires. I didn't think much of it. People came and went, and it wasn't unusual for someone to leave their car there overnight. The path was slick, but I didn't mind. It was one of those nights where everything felt calm, even with the rain picking up. The trees bent low, heavy with water, and the lights along the trail barely cut through the dark. I ran slower than usual, careful on the wet pavement. I'd gone about a mile in when it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of mud that had washed onto the path, and I went down hard. My ankle twisted under me, and the pain was sharp and immediate. I sat there, clutching it, feeling the cold seep through my leggings. The rain wasn't refreshing anymore. It was soaking through my jacket and making me shiver. I tried to stand, but my ankle buckled. It wasn't broken, but I couldn't put weight on it. My phone was back in the car. I hadn't thought I'd need it for a short run. I felt stupid and helpless sitting there in the rain. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought I'd imagined them, but they got louder, closer. A man came around the bend, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. He slowed when he saw me, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I think I twisted my ankle," I said. "I can't walk on it." He didn't respond right away, just stood there looking at me. His hood shadowed most of his face, but I could see his mouth, a thin line, not smiling. "Need help?" he asked after a long pause. "Yeah," I said, relief flooding through me. "If you could help me back to the parking lot, I'd really appreciate it." He didn't move. "No one else out here," he said, more to himself than to me. Bad night to be running. I didn't like the way he said it. There was no warmth in his tone, no concern. Just an observation, flat and detached. "I didn't think it'd get this bad," I said, trying to keep the conversation normal. "The rain, I mean." He stepped closer, and I instinctively leaned back. He crouched down, his face level with mine now. His eyes were dark, and there was something in them that made my stomach twist. He wasn't looking at my ankle. He was looking at me. "You're hurt pretty bad," he said, his voice quieter now. "Can't go anywhere like that." "I just need to get to my car," I said, my voice a little unsteady. "It's not far." He reached out suddenly, grabbing my ankle. I flinched, the pain shooting up my leg. "Doesn't look broken," he said, as if I hadn't already figured that out. His grip was too tight, and his fingers felt cold even through my wet clothes. "I'm fine," I said, pulling my leg away. "I just need help walking." He stood up, towering over me now. "I could carry you," he said, like it was the most logical thing in the world. "No, that's okay," I said quickly. "If you could just let me lean on you, that'd be enough." He didn't move. He was staring at me again, and I realized he hadn't blinked the whole time. The rain dripped from his hood, sliding down his face. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "Not safe." Something about the way he said it felt wrong, like he wasn't talking about the weather or the trail. My heart was pounding now, the cold and the rain forgotten. I tried to push myself up, but my ankle gave out again, and I fell back with a gasp. "Stay still," he said sharply. "You'll hurt yourself more." I didn't like the way he said it, like he was scolding me. I didn't like anything about him. I forced a smile, trying to keep things calm. "Thanks for stopping," I said, my voice shaking. "But I think I'll just wait here until someone else comes by." "No one else is coming," he said, almost casually. "Not this late." My stomach dropped. I hadn't even thought about the time. It was past 9, and the park closed at 10. He was probably right. No one else would be out here in this weather. He crouched down again, closer this time. "Let me help you," he said, his tone softer now. "You'll catch your death sitting here." Something in me snapped. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever he had planned. I grabbed a branch that had fallen nearby and held it up, the bark rough against my hands. "Stay back," I said, my voice firm. He didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed amused. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked, tilting his head. I didn't answer. My hands were trembling, but I kept the branch between us. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind cutting through my wet clothes. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, standing up again. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need your help," I said, edging back toward the trees. "Just leave me alone." He took a step forward, and I swung the branch, missing by inches. "Hey," he snapped, his voice angry now. "What's your problem?" I didn't wait for him to close the distance. I pushed myself up, leaning on the trees for support, and started limping away as fast as I could. My ankle screamed with every step, but I didn't care. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps faster than mine. "Come back," he shouted. "You're gonna get yourself killed out here." I didn't look back. The parking lot wasn't far. If I could just make it there, maybe someone would be pulling in or leaving. The path curved, and I lost sight of him for a moment. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in gasps. When I reached the lot, it was empty except for my car and the old sedan I'd seen earlier. My car was too far to make it, but the sedan was close. I ran to it, banging on the window. "Help. Please." The door opened, and an older woman leaned out, her eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "There's a man," I said, barely able to get the words out. "He's following me." She didn't hesitate. She opened the passenger door and helped me inside, locking it behind me. We watched the path together, but he never came out. I don't know if he gave up or if he was hiding, waiting for the next person to come along. The woman drove me to a nearby gas station, where I called for help. The police searched the park but didn't find anyone. They said it was probably just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. It was late, and the rain hadn't stopped all day. I was at the library trying to finish an essay that was already overdue, my laptop battery at 3%, and I still had no idea how to end the last paragraph. The lights flickered once, and I knew I couldn't push it any longer. When I packed up my things, the library was nearly empty. The rain outside had gotten heavier, the kind that turns streets into rivers. I sighed, looking at the umbrellas in the stand near the door. Mine was gone. Someone must have taken it by mistake, but I wasn't going to walk home in this weather without one. I grabbed a plain black umbrella that looked just like mine and stepped outside. The walk to my apartment wasn't far, just 10 minutes if I cut through the small park on the edge of campus. The rain made the whole world quieter. There was nothing but the sound of water hitting the pavement and the occasional car hissing by. The streets were empty, and most of the streetlights were reflected in puddles. I kept my head down and tried not to think about how cold it was. I noticed a man when I turned onto the path through the park. He was standing by one of the benches, his head tilted up, like he was looking at the rain. He had no umbrella or hood, just a dark jacket that clung to his shoulders. At first, I thought he was just someone who liked the rain, maybe taking a break from wherever he was going. But as I passed him, he turned and started walking in the same direction. I didn't think much of it. It was a public path, after all, and it wasn't unusual to see other students cutting through here. Still, something about the way his footsteps matched mine made me uneasy. I glanced back, and he was closer than I thought, his face hard to make out in the dim light. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp and clear over the rain. "That's my umbrella." I stopped, gripping the handle tighter. "What?" He took a few steps closer, his face coming into the light. He was older than me, maybe mid-30s, with wet hair plastered to his forehead and dark eyes that didn't seem to blink. "You took my umbrella," he said, his tone flat. I looked at the umbrella in my hand. It was just a plain black one, nothing special. "This was in the stand," I said. "I thought it was mine." "If it's yours, I'm sorry." "Here." I held it out to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he just stared at me, water dripping from his face. "You took it," he repeated, like I hadn't just offered it back. I felt my stomach tighten. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about the umbrella. "Look, I'm sorry," I said again, a little more firmly. "Take it." He still didn't move. I didn't know what else to do, so I set the umbrella on the ground and started walking again. The rain was colder now, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. His footsteps started again behind me. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "Wait." I ignored him, picking up my pace. My apartment building wasn't far now, just at the edge of the park. I could see the lights in the windows, warm and inviting. I was almost there when I heard his footsteps break into a run. Panic hit me like a wave, and I started running too, the water splashing around my ankles. My bag banged against my hip, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him getting closer, his breaths loud and uneven. I reached the door of my building and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was there, just a few feet away, his face pale and twisted with something I couldn't name. "Give it back," he shouted, his voice raw. "I left it on the path." I shouted back, my voice breaking. "It's right there." He didn't seem to hear me. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, twisting away, and the movement sent me crashing into the door. My keys slipped from my fingers and fell into the puddle at my feet. "Let go!" I yelled, my voice cracking. He didn't say anything this time, just pulled harder, dragging me away from the door. His strength was terrifying. I kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin, and he stumbled just enough for me to wrench free. I grabbed my keys and jammed them into the lock, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. The small window at the top was fogged with rain, but I could see him standing there, his hands pressed against the glass, his face twisted in anger. "You took it," he said again, his voice muffled but still clear. "You don't get to keep it." I didn't know what he meant. It was just an umbrella. A stupid, cheap umbrella. He stayed there for a long moment, his hands sliding down the glass, leaving streaks of water. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept expecting to hear him pounding on the door or see his face at the window. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I went back to the park. The umbrella was gone. It started late in the evening when I first noticed the figure outside. The rain had been pouring steadily for hours, tapping against the windows in a way that always made the house feel colder. I had been in the living room, half watching an old movie while scrolling through my phone, when something outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, but then I saw it clearly, a person standing across the street, motionless. The yellow of their raincoat stood out sharply against the dark, wet night. They were facing the house across from mine, standing perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. Their head tilted slightly, like they were looking in the windows. I remember thinking it was strange, but not enough to do anything. People act oddly sometimes. Maybe they were waiting for someone or trying to get out of the rain for a moment. It wasn't until later that I realized I had been glancing at the clock more and more, checking to see if they'd left. They didn't. An hour passed. The figure didn't move. They stayed there, facing that house, their shoulders stiff, their hands at their sides. I turned off the movie and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek out. The street light above them flickered slightly, casting their shadow long across the pavement. The rain was heavy, but I could still see the edges of their hood and the way their head was angled toward the lit windows across the street. I told myself to stop staring. It wasn't my business. But when I looked again, they had shifted slightly. Not toward the house they'd been facing, but toward mine. That's when the uneasiness started. It wasn't much at first, just a heavy feeling in my chest like something wasn't right. I locked the front door. The thought made me feel silly, but I couldn't shake the way my fingers lingered on the deadbolt, pressing it firmly into place. By midnight, the rain had gotten worse. The water ran in streams along the curb, and the sound of it was loud enough to drown out everything else. I tried to ignore the figure outside, but every time I looked, they were still there. The way they just stood without moving made my stomach twist. I convinced myself they'd leave eventually. No one would just stand in the rain all night. But then they moved. It wasn't a lot, just a step or two, but it was enough to make me sit up straight. They were walking now, slowly, their boots splashing in the water as they crossed the street. I couldn't see their face, only the shadow of their hood, but I could feel their focus. It wasn't on the house across the street anymore. It was on mine. I didn't turn off the lights, even though I wanted to. Something about being in the dark felt worse, like I wouldn't see them coming. Instead, I stayed near the window, keeping the curtain pulled back just enough to watch. The yellow raincoat was bright even in the dim streetlight. They stopped halfway across the street and just stood there, the water pooling around their feet. The rain made it impossible to hear anything, but I swear I saw their shoulders rise and fall, like they were breathing deeply. Their head tilted again, this time toward my window. I ducked back, my heart hammering. For a while, I stayed out of sight, pacing the living room and checking the locks on every door. I told myself to call someone, anyone, but the idea of trying to explain what was happening felt ridiculous. What would I say? There's someone standing outside in a raincoat? They haven't done anything. They haven't said anything. They're just there. When I worked up the nerve to look again, they were closer. The raincoat was now at the edge of my driveway. The shadow of the hood hid their face completely, but they were angled toward the house, and I knew they were looking. My throat felt tight, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone. I couldn't take my eyes off them, afraid they'd move the second I blinked. Then they did. It was slow and deliberate. They walked up the driveway, each step heavy and sure. I backed away from the window, my stomach twisting into knots. Every instinct told me not to look, not to let them know I was watching, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out again and saw them standing at the edge of the porch, just feet from the door. The rain made it hard to see details, but there was something in their hand. It was long and dark, like a piece of metal. I stared at it, trying to figure out what it was, when they raised it and tapped it lightly against the door frame. The sound was muffled by the rain, but I felt it. A hollow, deliberate knock. I backed away slowly, clutching my phone. I dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as I stammered out what was happening. She asked if the person had tried to break in or if they were threatening me. I told her no, but I didn't know what else to say. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried. I couldn't tell if they knew I was watching or if they were just waiting. The dispatcher promised to send someone, but I couldn't stop glancing at the front door, afraid that by the time help came, it would be too late. Then, the tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The rain was still pounding, masking every other sound. When I looked out the window again, they were gone. The raincoat was nowhere in sight, and the driveway was empty. For a moment, I thought they'd left. But then I heard a soft creak, not from the front door, but from the side of the house. My blood ran cold as I realized they were moving around, looking for another way in. The sound of footsteps came from the back now, slow and deliberate. I locked myself in the bathroom, my phone pressed to my ear as I whispered to the dispatcher that they were still here. She told me to stay calm, that help was on the way, but her voice felt distant, like I was underwater. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. I froze, the phone slipping from my hands. There was no knock this time, no tapping. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure they could hear it. I pressed myself against the far wall, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. Then, finally, I heard the sound of sirens. They started faint, growing louder as they approached. The footsteps retreated quickly, the sound fading into the rain. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty, and the figure in the yellow raincoat was gone. The officers searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. All that was left was a single muddy streak on the side of the house, right below the bathroom window. The rain started coming down just after I left the grocery store, heavier than I expected. I had planned to walk the 2 miles back home. It wasn't far, and I liked the fresh air, but this wasn't just a light drizzle. It was pouring, cold and relentless, soaking me through in minutes. I had no umbrella, just a bag of groceries I was now holding against my chest to keep dry. I hurried along the sidewalk, keeping my head down against the wind, when I saw the bus stop up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small glass shelter with a bench inside, but it would keep the rain off. I picked up my pace, my shoes squelching with every step, and ducked under the awning with a sigh of relief. The rain hammered against the roof and the glass walls, loud and unrelenting. I was about to set my bag down and check my phone when I noticed I wasn't alone. There was someone else there, sitting on the bench, a man. He looked up when I entered, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a blank expression. His clothes were wet, his jeans dark with rainwater, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Something about the way he was sitting, hunched forward with his legs spread wide, made him seem bigger than he really was. I nodded to him, not sure what else to do, and stood off to the side, leaning against the glass. There wasn't much room under the awning, and I didn't want to crowd him. The rain was coming in sideways, though, and the wind kept blowing it against my legs. I shuffled closer to the center, trying to stay dry. He didn't move or look away, and I could feel his eyes on me as I adjusted my bag and wiped the water off my face. It was awkward, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just tired or cold. We were both stuck here, after all, waiting for the rain to let up. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't an unusual thing to ask, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated before answering, keeping my voice casual. "Yeah, not far," I said. "Just waiting out the rain." He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about that. His eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, but the screen was too wet to work. I shoved it back in my pocket and tried to focus on the rain instead of the strange tension in the air. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said after a long pause. I glanced at him, unsure if he was trying to be helpful or threatening. His tone was flat, hard to read. I forced a small smile, not wanting to make things worse. "It's just rain," I said. "I'll be fine." He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. His boots were caked with mud, leaving streaks on the floor. He was taking up most of the space now, and I could feel the cold spray of the rain against my back as I tried to stay out of his way. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on my neck standing up. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put into words. I thought about leaving, but the rain was still coming down hard, and I didn't want to get soaked again. Then he stood up. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it made me flinch anyway. He was taller than I'd realized, broad-shouldered and solid. He stepped closer, his hands still in his pockets, and I pressed myself against the glass, trying to keep some distance between us. "You're taking up a lot of room," he said, his voice sharper now. "I was here first." I blinked at him, confused. There was plenty of room in the shelter, enough for both of us. But the way he was looking at me, his eyes narrowing, made it clear he didn't want me there. "I'm not trying to bother you," I said carefully. "I'll stay over here." He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. The rain was pouring behind him, a solid wall of water. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic building in my chest. "I think you should go," he said, his voice cold. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want to step out into the storm, leaving myself vulnerable. "Look, I'm just waiting for the rain to stop," I said. "I'll be gone as soon as it lets up." He didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer, and I realized just how trapped I was. The shelter was small, the glass walls offering no escape. I could see the rainwater pooling at the edges, dripping onto the floor. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and menacing. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My hands tightened around my bag, the only thing I had to defend myself with. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." He smirked at that, a cruel twist of his lips. "Trouble?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think I'm trouble?" Before I could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing my arm. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight, his face inches from mine. "You need to learn some respect," he hissed. I didn't think. I swung my bag at him, the weight of the groceries knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, letting go of my arm, and I took the opportunity to push past him, running out into the rain. The cold water hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The rain blurred everything, the streetlights casting faint glows in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where cars were passing by, their headlights cutting through the storm. I flagged down a driver, my voice barely audible over the rain, and begged them to help. They let me in, and I explained what had happened as they drove me to safety. By the time the police arrived at the bus stop, the man was gone. I still don't know what he wanted or what he might have done if I hadn't fought back. But I can't forget the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to enjoy the fear he was causing. Now, every time it rains, I can't help but think about that night and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to cross his path. I still can't believe it happened. It feels like a nightmare that I somehow managed to wake up from, but it wasn't a dream. It was real. The storm that night was one of the worst I've seen in years. The rain wasn't just falling, it was pouring, coming down in sheets, battering everything it touched. The wind was howling, rattling the windows, making the house creak and groan. It felt like the world outside had been swallowed by the storm. It was around 10 p.m. when I realized I had a problem. I'd noticed a small leak in the roof the day before, but with everything going on, I kept putting it off. That night, after a few hours of rain, I saw a small puddle forming on the kitchen floor under the window. It wasn't much, but I knew if I didn't take care of it, it would get worse. I couldn't afford to have more water damage, so I decided to climb up into the attic and patch the leak myself. I grabbed my ladder from the garage and set it up outside the back door, directly under the small overhang of the roof. I knew it wasn't ideal, the rain was making the ground slippery, but I figured it wouldn't take long. Just enough time to fix the leak and get back inside before the storm got any worse. The ladder creaked a little when I climbed up, but it held steady. I could barely hear the wind over the pounding rain, but I focused on the task at hand. I remember thinking how strange it was that I was the only one out in the storm. The street was quiet, no lights on anywhere else in the neighborhood. Just the rain, the wind, and the occasional flash of lightning. I had just started to loosen the shingles when the first thing went wrong. My foot slipped. I didn't even have time to react. I felt my whole body pitch sideways, and before I knew it, I was hitting the ground. My back slammed hard into the wet grass, knocking the wind out of me, and I let out a gasp, trying to push myself up. The impact left me dazed, and I could barely catch my breath. I lay there for a second, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I heard something that made my heart stop. A footstep. It was faint, just a soft sound, but it was definitely there. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm. Someone was outside. My heart raced, and I slowly lifted my head, looking around in the dark. The rain was so heavy, I could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky. I was too disoriented to think clearly, but the feeling of someone being out there, watching, gripped me hard. I couldn't make out anything through the rain, but the sound of the footsteps wasn't getting any further away. I held my breath, hoping I was imagining it, but then I heard a low voice. "Hello," the voice called. I froze. It wasn't loud, just quiet enough to be unsettling. It sounded like a man, but I couldn't tell if he was close or far away. My body tensed. The last thing I wanted to do was confront whoever was out there, but I also didn't want to stay outside alone, exposed, while there was someone lurking around my property in the middle of a storm. "Is someone out there?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was no answer for a moment. The wind howled again, and the rain pounded the ground so loudly it almost drowned out my own voice. But then, I heard it again. The voice, a little closer this time. "Yeah, I'm just trying to find some shelter. You all right?" I didn't know what to make of it. I should have been scared, but there was something in the tone that didn't quite sit right. It wasn't the voice of someone lost or seeking help, it sounded almost casual. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just had a little accident." My ladder slipped. There was another pause, and then the voice spoke again, this time sounding almost too calm. "Can I help you?" I felt a chill run down my spine. I should have gone inside, locked the door, and called for help. But I was standing in the rain, wet and aching, and I felt an irrational need to make sure this person wasn't just going to walk away. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound more assertive. A few seconds passed before the voice replied, and it was so close now that I could feel my pulse quicken. "Just someone looking for a little shelter," the voice said, and this time it sounded almost like a smirk in his tone. I turned around quickly, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, but the rain was blurring everything. The more I tried to focus, the harder it became to see anything clearly. I was standing there, exposed, my back to the house, and I had no idea where this person was. "I need to go inside," I said, my voice wavering. "It's dangerous out here." I backed toward the house slowly, not turning my back on the sound of the voice. "You sure you're all right?" the man asked, stepping closer now, just on the edge of my hearing. "I could come help you up." "You don't look so good." I felt something shift inside of me. This wasn't just a stranger asking if I needed help. This was something else. His tone, his words, they felt wrong, like he was toying with me, testing how far he could push. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the key. My heart was pounding now, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. Before I could turn the key in the lock, the man spoke again, this time louder, his voice just a few feet away. "Let me help you in," he said, his voice too soft, too knowing. The door finally opened, and I didn't hesitate. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it as quickly as I could. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. The rain still hammered against the windows, the wind howling outside. I didn't dare look outside again. My head was spinning, but the one thought that kept repeating in my mind was that he had been so close, too close. I still don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I know one thing for sure, something was off. And I was never going to forget the feeling of being watched in the middle of that storm. I was driving home that night from a late meeting. It had been raining hard for hours, the kind of rain that makes it feel like you're driving through a sheet of water. The road was slick, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I wasn't far from the exit to my neighborhood, just a quiet stretch of highway I knew well. Not much happened out there at night. It was mostly empty except for the occasional car, but tonight it seemed quieter than usual. I had just passed the old gas station when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another car pulled over to the side, waiting for the rain to pass. But then I saw the hazard lights flashing. No one was around, and the car was in a weird position, almost like it had been abandoned. I couldn't tell from a distance whether it was just someone waiting for help, but something about the situation made me uneasy. There was no reason for a car to be stopped in the middle of nowhere in the rain, especially with those hazard lights on, blinking in the storm. I slowed down, rolling the window down a little, trying to get a better look. No other cars were in sight, and the road was so empty that the sight of a single car with its lights flashing stood out like a sore thumb. I couldn't just keep driving by without checking. The rational part of me told me I should call the police, but I figured if someone needed help, I should at least see what was going on. I pulled over a few feet behind the car, the tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. It was a mid-sized sedan, an older model, its rear bumper dented. I couldn't see any signs of what might have happened, but it was just too odd, sitting there, lights on, engine off, like someone had left it in a hurry. I got out of my car, keeping an eye on the road. No cars in sight, just the rain pouring down. The car I was walking toward had its driver's side door wide open. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, listening to the soft thrum of the rain against the pavement. The rain was so heavy that I barely heard anything else, but there was something about the scene that felt wrong, too quiet. The door was still ajar when I reached it. I leaned in and looked inside. That's when I saw it. The seat was soaked, but not from the rain. The car was a mess, papers scattered on the floor, and the driver's seat was turned awkwardly to the side. The first thing I noticed was the blood. It wasn't a lot, but there were smears on the seat, on the steering wheel, and on the door. It looked like someone had been dragged out of the car, or maybe forced into it. The blood wasn't fresh, but it was still visible enough that I could tell something violent had happened. My stomach turned, and I took a step back, unsure of what I should do next. I looked around. The rain was coming down in sheets, and it felt like I was the only one around. No one else had stopped, and the road was empty. I glanced back into the car, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was a bag on the passenger seat, just sitting there, like the owner had dropped it in a hurry. I don't know why, but I reached inside the car and pulled the bag out. It felt wrong touching someone else's stuff like that, but I couldn't help myself. Maybe I thought there was something inside that would explain what had happened, some sign that could make sense of all this. I unzipped it slowly, my hand shaking more than I expected, and found a wallet, a few personal items, and a phone. The phone had a cracked screen, but when I turned it over, the first thing I noticed was a message on the screen, one of those text notifications that didn't require unlocking. The message was simple: get to the car. Now! It was sent about 15 minutes ago. My blood ran cold. The phone wasn't recent, it had been sitting there for a while. But the message was fresh. Who was it for? I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been here recently. But where were they now? And what had happened to them? I glanced around, my mind racing. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft at first, but then louder. Footsteps. I froze, turning my head slowly. My heart hammered in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Someone else was out there. I didn't wait around to find out who. I shoved the bag back inside the car, my pulse racing. I started to back away, my eyes darting around the dark, wet landscape. The rain felt colder now, as if the air had suddenly dropped several degrees. I rushed to my car, almost slipping in the rain as I got back inside. I locked the door before I even turned the engine on, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. I looked through the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I didn't see anything at first. No one was following me, but I didn't feel safe. My heart was still racing. My mind kept going back to the blood, the message on the phone, the odd feeling of being watched. I drove off quickly, my tires skidding slightly as I accelerated, trying to leave the scene behind me. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The blood in the car. The phone. The message. I drove for what felt like forever before I finally pulled over at a gas station, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I tried to catch my breath, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept thinking about the car, the blood, the message. What had really happened there? Who was hurt? And where were they now? I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? I hadn't seen anything that could help them. No one else was around. There was no sign of a struggle outside the car, just the blood inside. I didn't have answers, and that scared me even more. I didn't know what was happening, and the longer I stayed in that spot, the more I felt like I was part of something I didn't understand. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever happened, it wasn't over. I wasn't sure if it would be for me or someone else next, but the whole experience left me with a deep sense of unease. Something bad had happened out there, and I was far from the only one affected. I'll start by saying that I never wanted to be in that basement. Ever. I never asked to be there. But that night, everything changed. It had been raining heavily for days, and the forecast predicted another storm. I had just moved into the house, a quiet, somewhat secluded place on the edge of town. The house was old, but I loved it. It was the kind of place you could picture yourself growing old in, with a big front porch and an overgrown garden in the back. It had character, sure, but it was perfect for me. At least, that's what I thought. It wasn't long before I noticed the flooding. I started to hear strange sounds from the basement, but I ignored them at first. Old houses make noise, right? The first time I went down there, I was just going to check on some boxes I had shoved to the back. When I opened the door, the damp smell hit me. Not unusual, I thought. It had been rainy, and the basement was always a little musty. The next morning, I went down again to grab a few things, and that's when I saw the water. It was only a couple inches deep, but enough to make me uneasy. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later, but it seemed like the house had taken on more water than I realized. I went back upstairs to grab towels and a mop, trying to get ahead of it before it became too much. By the time I returned, the water had risen even higher. Panic set in, but I kept calm. I started moving the boxes, books, and some of the furniture that had been left in the basement when I moved in. There were some family heirlooms I didn't want to lose. The water was getting colder, creeping into the edges of the room. It was clear the basement had some drainage issues, but it was too late now to worry about that. I was kneeling, shifting one of the boxes, when I noticed something odd. A section of the wall near the back of the basement was different. The wood looked slightly darker, almost like it had been exposed to water more than the rest of the walls. There was a small gap at the bottom, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make me curious. I stood up and moved toward it, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The water lapped at my boots as I knelt down to inspect it. My fingers brushed the edge of the wall. It was strange, cold to the touch, and slightly damp. I pushed against it with more force than I meant to, and the panel shifted. I froze. Behind the panel, there was a small space. I wasn't sure if it was a mistake or something intentional, but it looked like the wall had been covering a hidden door, one I hadn't noticed when I moved in. My breath caught in my throat, and I suddenly didn't know if I wanted to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the edge of the panel, pulled it out, and revealed the dark opening behind it. The air felt colder, and the basement seemed to get quieter somehow. The rain outside was still coming down hard, but it almost sounded muffled in comparison to the silence in the basement. I found a small wooden door, old and warped. There was no handle, but there were markings on the wood, deep gouges, almost like something had scraped along the surface for a long time. I hesitated, staring at the door. Something about it felt off, but I pushed past the feeling and grabbed the edge, pulling it open. It creaked loudly as it moved, and my stomach dropped. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air in there was musty, stale, and so cold it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't look away. There was something about it that pulled me in, like it was waiting for me. I stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a few people to stand in. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just some old, rotting furniture and dust everywhere. But then I saw them items scattered around the floor. Old, strange objects that didn't belong there. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Some of it looked like trash, old papers, broken glass, but there were others, things that I couldn't explain. There was a chair in the corner, stained with something that wasn't just dirt. My heart raced as I looked closer at the items. On the floor next to the chair, there was a small, old-fashioned mirror. It was cracked, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy, like it was watching me. My mind was starting to race, trying to make sense of everything. I stepped back, my body trembling. Something told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. In the middle of the room, there was a small, worn wooden box. I approached it slowly, not sure if I really wanted to open it, but I did. Inside, there were more things, more disturbing items, a handful of dried flowers, a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, and something wrapped in an old, dirty cloth. I unwrapped the cloth, and that's when I found it. A small, rusted key. It was so old that it looked like it shouldn't even exist anymore. My hands shook as I held it. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized that this was no random collection of forgotten belongings. It was deliberate. Someone had placed everything here, and it was meant for someone, maybe me, to find. I stood there, still holding the key, the dark room pressing in around me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop staring at the key. And then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it. A noise. From upstairs. A door creaked, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was in the house. Someone who shouldn't have been. I couldn't breathe. I dropped the key, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and bolted toward the door. But as I reached it, I glanced over my shoulder. I couldn't stop myself. The chair in the corner was different. Someone had moved it. It wasn't where I had left it. I didn't wait. I ran back upstairs, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't even bother to check the water in the basement. The flooding, the room, the key, it all seemed too real, too horrifying to comprehend. I got out of the house that night. I called a friend to pick me up and never went back. The place was left behind, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I still wonder who lived there before me, and what they were hiding. And, more than anything, I wonder if they're still watching from that dark room. I don't know what made me go out there that night. I wish I hadn't, but I did. I can still feel the weight of it when I think back. The rain was coming down hard, pounding against the windows like it had something to prove. The wind howled, and I could hear the trees outside creaking and bending with the storm. I was alone at the time, just trying to relax after a long day, curled up on the couch with a book. The only light came from the dim glow of the lamp beside me, and it was quiet, save for the sound of the rain. Then, I heard it. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the storm, maybe the wind making something rattle, but then I heard it again. It was faint, almost muffled, but there was no mistaking it. The sound of something scraping against the shed in my backyard. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. It was late, and I hadn't heard anything earlier. The shed had always been just a place to store old garden tools and things I never used, but in that moment, it seemed so much more ominous. I tried to tell myself it was just a storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noise came again, a scraping sound, followed by something heavier, like a footstep. It was clear now, someone or something was out there. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but I didn't. I don't know why, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the thought that if I made that call, I'd seem foolish. Who would be outside in this weather? Who would be in my shed? But then the idea settled in my mind. What if someone was breaking in? What if they needed help? The thought of someone being hurt, someone in distress, kept me from just running back into the house. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, wrapped myself in my raincoat, and headed outside. I stepped out into the yard, my boots sinking into the soggy ground. The rain felt cold against my skin, but it didn't matter. My heart was racing in my chest. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the shed, my hands shaking. The beam flickered at first, but then it steadied, cutting through the darkness. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew someone or something was out there. I took a few steps forward, the wet grass slick underfoot. I was just about to reach the door of the shed when I heard the noise again. This time, it was a thud. It made me jump, and my grip on the flashlight tightened. The door to the shed was slightly ajar, not enough for someone to get out, but enough for me to see a sliver of movement inside. I hesitated. I almost turned back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I pulled the door open, and the hinges squeaked loudly in the still night air. The shed smelled of old wood, damp and musty, and I had to squint in the dim light of my flashlight to make out anything. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Is someone in here?" There was a moment of silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the roof, but then, just as I thought maybe I was imagining things, I heard it. A soft, strained voice. It came from the far corner of the shed, barely above a whisper. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was weak, but it was real. I took a cautious step forward, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There, in the corner, I saw movement. A figure hunched down, its head bent, shoulders shuddering. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were sitting on the floor, almost curled up in a ball. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's going on?" There was a long pause before the figure responded, but when they did, it was in a low, raspy voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "I need to stay here. Please, don't make me leave." I stood there, staring at the shape in the corner, trying to make sense of what was going on. I had so many questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. Who was this person? How had they gotten in? Why were they hiding in my shed in the middle of a storm? "What do you mean? What are you doing here?" I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they shifted in place, and I heard the scrape of metal on the floor. My flashlight flickered again, and I realized they were holding something in their hand, something long and metallic. A knife, maybe? The fear that had been building inside me turned to panic. I should have run, I should have turned and left the shed, but for some reason, I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the figure straightened up. "You have to help me," they said, their voice now louder, more urgent. "I can't go back. Please. I can't go back." I had no idea who they were or what they were talking about, but I knew I couldn't stay. Something was wrong. It felt wrong. This was no stranger asking for help. This was something else, something darker. I turned to leave, my heart racing in my chest, when the figure suddenly moved toward me. They stumbled, dragging themselves across the floor. I was too slow to react, and before I knew it, they were standing in front of me, blocking the door. "You can't leave. I need you to stay," they said, their voice now frantic, desperate. I didn't have a choice. I was trapped in the small shed, the door behind me blocked. My only option was to get past them. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing my phone, but before I could pull it out, the figure lunged. I don't know how I did it, but I pushed them back with all my strength. They stumbled, and for a split second, I thought I might have a chance. Without thinking, I bolted out the door and into the rain. I didn't look back, not once. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house, locking the door behind me. I called the police right away. When they arrived, they found nothing in the shed. No person, no evidence of anyone being there. But they did take a report. They checked the area, but they didn't find anything suspicious. They said I must have imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks on my mind. I haven't been able to shake the feeling, though. Every time it storms, I hear that voice in my head. Please, don't make me leave. It doesn't go away. Whoever that person was, and whatever they wanted, I don't think they were really asking for help. And that thought still haunts me every time the rain starts to fall. It was one of those nights where the rain never really stops. The kind of storm that makes the streets look like rivers, and the wind howls loud enough to drown out everything else. I had been walking home from my shift at work, soaked through despite the umbrella, and I was so ready to be inside, away from the weather. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare, not bothering to check which car it was. I just wanted to get home. I watched the little map on my phone, waiting for the car to pull up. I wasn't far from the usual spot where I'd get picked up, and I saw the pin slowly move closer, the car approaching. As it got near, I stepped to the curb and looked up. A black sedan was coming down the road, slowing down. I stepped forward, glad the wait was almost over. When the car stopped in front of me, the window rolled down, and the driver looked out. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with dark hair and a beard. His face was tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. I didn't think much of it. I got in the back seat, thanked him, and told him where I was headed. I just wanted to get home, have some tea, and relax. The last thing on my mind was that something was wrong. The driver didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, and then he started driving. The route on my app didn't seem right, though. We weren't heading in the direction I expected. I had been in this part of town enough to know the main roads, and I could tell we were heading south when I should have been going north. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're going the wrong way." He didn't say anything at first. Just kept driving. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was new to the area. I tried again. "I need to go to Maple Street, not South Boulevard." "You've missed the turn." He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, and I caught the briefest glimpse of something strange in his eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something else. Something colder. But then he spoke. "It's a shortcut," he said, his voice flat, like he was explaining something simple. "Don't worry. You'll get there." I didn't believe him. I checked my phone again. The little pin on the map was still moving in the wrong direction. We weren't heading toward Maple Street. The more I stared at the screen, the more I realized we were going farther away from where I needed to be. "Are you sure about this?" I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "I really need to go that way." I pointed to the north, trying to be calm, but I felt a rising sense of panic. The driver didn't reply. Instead, he just turned the corner and accelerated. The streets were empty, and the rain continued to fall, hammering against the car's roof. I tried not to think too much about the fact that we were now on streets I didn't recognize. "Hey, can you stop the car?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "I need to get out." He still didn't respond. He didn't even glance at me in the mirror this time. I began to feel the weight of the silence in the car. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was thickening. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the windshield and the hum of the engine, but it all felt distant. I was alone in this car with him, and it was getting harder to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what was happening. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This felt deliberate. I needed to get out. I needed to get home. "Stop the car," I demanded, louder this time, my voice trembling. "I'm not going any farther with you. Stop the car, now." Finally, he glanced at me in the mirror. He didn't smile. He didn't look worried. He just looked tired, as if he had been waiting for me to say something for a long time. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice low and calm, like he was trying to reassure me. But I could hear something in it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold. And it didn't sound like he was trying to comfort me. It sounded like a command. "I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Pull over. Let me out." But he didn't. The car kept moving. The streets around us were getting more desolate. The houses were spaced farther apart, and I couldn't even see streetlights now, just a dim glow of his headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. My mind was racing. I reached for my phone again, hands shaking, and I tried to send a message to a friend. My hands were so wet that I could barely type, but I managed to send the message. "Something's wrong. The driver is going the wrong way. Please call the cops if I don't respond." It felt like forever before I saw him glance in the mirror again. This time, his eyes lingered longer, and I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. He wasn't taking me to my destination. He was taking me somewhere else. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice betrayed me, breaking as I spoke. "Relax," he said again, his voice like a slow drawl. "You're going to be fine. We're almost there." I had no idea where there was, but I wasn't about to find out. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and tried the door. It was locked. I tried to press the button to open the door from the inside, but it didn't work. He had locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the car, desperate for something, anything to help. I had to get out. I reached for the handle again, this time pulling with everything I had. The door clicked, and I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, yanked it wide, and as the car slowed for a turn, I threw myself out of it. I hit the wet pavement hard, my knees scraping against the ground as I scrambled to my feet. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I didn't look back. I just ran. My shoes were soaked, my legs screaming, but I didn't care. I ran and ran, not stopping until I found a house with lights on. I knocked frantically, and someone finally answered. A woman in her pajamas, clearly startled. I couldn't even explain myself properly. I was so shaken. but she took one look at me and called the police. The cops came. I don't know what they did with the driver, but I know I never saw him again. They didn't find him that night, not in the places I thought he might have gone. They said it was likely he just picked someone up for whatever reason and got scared when I tried to leave. Maybe he was trying to get away with something. I don't know. The ride was supposed to be the end of my shift, the end of a tiring night. But it turned into something else. Something I won't forget. That driver, he wasn't just lost. He knew exactly where he was going. And I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't take ride-sharing anymore. Not after that night. It was one of those nights where the rain never stopped. The sky had been a thick, dark blanket of clouds all evening, and it seemed like the storm was only getting worse. The kind of rain that makes everything feel damp, even when you're inside. The roads were slick, and I could barely see through the windshield. The wipers worked overtime, but they still couldn't keep up with the downpour. I had one last stop before I could head home for the night. A delivery for a house out in a quiet neighborhood. The GPS said it would only take a few more minutes, so I pressed on, hoping to finish quickly and get out of the storm. The house was on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd expect to find only a few houses with lights on. I pulled up to the curb, careful not to splash the puddles that had formed along the edge of the road. The porch light was on, and there was a package sitting on the doorstep, already slightly soaked from the rain. I grabbed the package, stepped out of the van, and hurried up to the door, hoping I wouldn't get drenched. As I placed the package down and rang the doorbell, I noticed something odd. The blinds were pulled back, and there was a figure standing just inside the window, watching me. I couldn't see much, just the silhouette of a person. I thought nothing of it at the time. I'd seen that before. People were curious about their packages. I turned to leave, but as I reached the van, the porch light flicked off. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. I still had one more stop to make before heading home. But then, just as I was about to get back into the van, I heard the door behind me creak open. I turned around to see a man standing in the doorway, his face shadowed by the overhang of the porch. He looked normal enough, nothing out of the ordinary, at least at first glance. But the look in his eyes, it was unsettling. "Did you just leave something on my doorstep?" he asked, his voice sharp and filled with suspicion. "Yeah," I replied, my hand still on the van door handle. "A package. For Mr. Hartley, right?" His eyes narrowed. "That's not my package. I didn't order anything." I was taken aback. "It's for this address," I said, showing him the label on my phone. "It's right here. Mr. Hartley." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, cutting me off. "You've stolen it. You're trying to steal my package." I blinked. "What?" "No, I didn't." Before I could say anything else, he stepped out onto the porch, blocking my way to the van. I felt a chill run down my spine. His whole demeanor had shifted from confused to outright hostile. "I want you to prove it. Come inside and show me the receipt or whatever you have. Prove you didn't steal my package." I didn't know what to say. It was a strange request, but I knew I needed to get out of there. "Look, I'm just a delivery driver. I leave the packages at the door. I don't handle the receipts or anything." He wasn't having it. "I don't care. I want you inside now." I felt a rush of panic. There was something off about this situation. I could sense it, even though I didn't know exactly what was wrong. He wasn't acting like someone who just wanted to sort out a misunderstanding. He was angry, almost too angry. "Please, just let me go," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I can call my supervisor if you need confirmation. I'm just doing my job." But he didn't budge. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping low, like he was speaking to someone he didn't trust. I said, "Come inside. Now." Something clicked inside me, and I knew I had to get away. I wasn't sure what this guy was planning, but the vibe was all wrong. I quickly stepped back, my eyes scanning the area for an escape. The rain was pouring harder, the wind making the trees sway, but I didn't care about getting wet. I just needed to leave. "Listen," I said, my voice shaking now. "I don't have time for this. I'm not going inside with you." He stepped forward again, his hand reaching for my arm. I jerked back, fear surging through me. I wasn't strong enough to fight him off, and I knew I wasn't fast enough either. "Stop," he growled, his hand now gripping my wrist. "I'll make sure you never work again if you don't come inside." His grip tightened, and panic set in. I could feel my heart racing, my stomach churning. I needed to get away, fast. I yanked my arm out of his grasp, stumbling backward toward the van. "You better not make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low and cold. He stepped toward me again, but this time, I didn't wait. I turned and ran for the van. I didn't even bother with the door. I just scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed it shut, locking it immediately. I could see him standing on the porch, staring at me, his face twisted in anger. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the van in gear. The tires squealed as I sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror. I didn't see him follow. I didn't see anything except the rain and the flashing of my headlights on the slick, wet road. When I finally got back to the safety of my office, I called my supervisor. I explained what had happened, but he wasn't much help. "It's a misunderstanding," he said. "You probably just startled him. People can be a little odd." But I didn't feel reassured. There was something in that man's eyes, something dark. I don't know what his plan was, but I know it wasn't good. I finished my shift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The whole time, I kept thinking about that man and the look on his face. He'd wanted to trap me, keep me there, force me inside his house. I didn't know if he was planning on calling the cops or something worse, but either way, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I haven't been back to that neighborhood since. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next delivery driver to make a wrong turn. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. I had been driving for hours, alone on a long stretch of road that had practically no streetlights. The kind of road where your headlights are the only thing guiding you. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I had to keep the wipers on full speed to even have a chance of seeing through the windshield. It was already late, and I was exhausted, just trying to get home. I don't know exactly what made me look up, but something caught my eye, a flash of something dark ahead. My heart dropped when I realized it was a truck, flipped over, blocking the road. I wasn't expecting to see that in the middle of nowhere. The truck had clearly been in a bad accident, and from what I could make out, it was badly damaged. I could barely see the outline of the vehicle through the rain, but the shape was unmistakable. I slowed down, pulling my car off to the side of the road. There was no other traffic, no sign of any other drivers. The road was empty, and the storm had swallowed up the world around me. My first instinct was to stop, check for survivors. If there was anyone left alive in that wreck, they'd need help. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but I didn't have much of a signal. It was too spotty in that area. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was a wreck. I needed help, but I wasn't going to be able to do much alone. I got out of my car, feeling the cold rain soak through my jacket. The air smelled like wet asphalt and something else, something sour. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach turn. As I got closer to the truck, I saw that it had completely overturned, lying on its side in the mud. The driver's side was the most damaged, crushed up against the ground, while the passenger side was barely visible. The rear of the truck was still intact, though. I couldn't see anyone inside. The truck's engine was still running, the headlights flickering weakly. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I made my way around to the driver's side. I called out, but no one answered. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I pushed it aside. There had to be someone, right? Someone in need of help. I reached the driver's side and tried the door, but it was jammed shut. I couldn't open it, and the windows were too dark to see through. I tried the other side of the truck, thinking maybe I could get in that way. That's when I noticed something strange, a strange, pungent smell coming from the back of the truck, mixed with the wet earth and rain. It wasn't until I rounded the back of the truck that I saw it clearly, rows of cages stacked inside. I froze. There were people in those cages. At first, I thought they were just unconscious, or maybe in shock from the crash. But as I stepped closer, I realized with sickening clarity that they were alive. Their eyes were wide, some of them were shaking, and they were all locked in place. I couldn't tell if they were bound with ropes or chains, but their arms and legs were clearly restricted. I felt a wave of nausea, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at them, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an accident, it was something worse. Much worse. I looked back at the truck's cab, wondering who the driver was, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had come to check on these people. I reached into my pocket for my phone again, trying to get a better signal to call 911, but it was useless. The signal was still terrible. I was standing there, trying to think, when I heard a sound. Footsteps. I quickly ducked behind the truck, my heart racing. I was so focused on the people in the back that I didn't hear them coming. It was two men, walking toward the truck, talking in low voices. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could hear their voices, and the tone wasn't friendly. They were laughing about something, but I didn't understand what. The rain was too loud. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't spot me. I didn't know if they were the ones who had been driving the truck, or if they were involved in whatever this was, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden for much longer. I was terrified. I had no idea what to do. One of the men reached the truck first. He was wearing a raincoat, but the dark silhouette of his figure made him look even more menacing. The other man was behind him, walking toward the cages in the back. I pressed my back flat against the cold metal of the truck, praying they wouldn't turn around and see me. The first man opened the back of the truck with a sharp, metallic sound. I heard the rattling of the cages. The other man's voice rose up, something about checking the cargo. They weren't talking about the crash. They were talking about the people in those cages like they were nothing more than goods to be moved. I had no idea what to do. I had to help them, but if I moved, I was risking everything. I had no way of knowing if these men were armed or if they'd hurt me. I looked around quickly. The road was still empty, and there were no other houses for miles. I couldn't count on anyone else coming. I could feel the panic starting to rise again. My hands were trembling, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay quiet. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave without calling for help. The phone was useless, but I had to get away from these men first. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was then that I heard the men talking again. One of them had opened a phone, and I heard a voice on the other end. They were discussing something about moving the cargo. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't an accident. This was a plan. A sick, twisted plan. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving them. When I got far enough to where I thought they wouldn't hear me, I turned and ran as quietly as I could. I didn't look back until I got back to my car, and even then, I was afraid they might be following me. I didn't stop until I was in a safer area with better cell service. I finally called the police, but by the time they arrived, the truck and the men were gone. There was no trace of them. They must have heard the sirens coming, or maybe they knew the cops were on their way. I don't know, but it was gone. The cages were gone. The people, whoever they were gone. I've thought about that night every day since. I can't shake the image of those poor people in the back of that truck, trapped and helpless. I don't know what happened to them, but I hope they somehow got out. I hope they did. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I had planned the route carefully, packed light, and set out early enough to make it back before dark. The weather forecast had called for scattered clouds and the occasional light drizzle, but nothing that would make the trail dangerous. I should have known better, though. It's always the unexpected things that get you. The rain started coming down around mid-afternoon. At first, it was just a few drops here and there, nothing to worry about. But then the sky opened up. It went from light showers to a downpour in minutes. The kind of rain that drenches you completely, making everything slippery and slick. I figured it was best to find some shelter until it passed, but the trail didn't have much in the way of cover. There were no large trees, and the few small ones couldn't offer enough protection. I kept walking, hoping it would let up, but it didn't. After about 30 minutes of slogging through the wet mud, I spotted something through the trees, a cabin. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town, but I knew it was probably someone's hunting cabin. The place didn't look like it was being used, and there was no sign of life, but it was a shelter. That was enough for me. I figured I'd just take a quick break and wait for the rain to ease up. I approached the cabin cautiously. There was no one around, and the place looked like it had been abandoned for years, covered in moss, with the wood starting to rot in spots. Still, it would keep me dry. I walked up to the door and tried the handle. To my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, hoping no one would show up to kick me out. The inside was small, one room with a small fireplace and a dusty table in the middle. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I shrugged it off. It was just a storm, and I needed a dry spot to sit for a while. So, I closed the door behind me, took off my jacket, and shook off as much water as I could. I could hear the rain pounding against the roof, and the wind howling outside, but at least I was warm. About 15 minutes passed. I was beginning to think the storm was going to stick around for a while when I heard a noise outside. At first, it was just a faint sound, maybe the wind, or a branch breaking in the trees. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps, like someone was walking up to the cabin. My heart jumped in my chest. I didn't think anyone else was out here. It was too remote. The trail was empty when I started, and I hadn't seen anyone for hours. I held my breath and listened, trying to figure out if I had heard what I thought I had. The footsteps were getting closer. I froze, unsure of what to do. I wasn't supposed to be here. The cabin didn't look like it was meant for anyone but the person who owned it, and I wasn't about to get caught trespassing. Then I heard the door handle rattle. My blood ran cold. I quickly ducked behind the table, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just anyone. The man who walked in was wearing a long coat, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He was soaked, like he'd been out in the rain longer than I had. The door closed behind him with a thud. I stayed still, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I didn't know who he was, but I had a bad feeling. I wasn't supposed to be here, and now I was trapped. The storm outside was worse than ever, and there was no way I was going to make it back to the trail without getting drenched. But that didn't matter right now. The man in the cabin was a problem. He didn't speak for a while. Just stood there, probably shaking off the rain. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice me crouched behind the table. But then he spoke. "What the hell are you doing in my cabin?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. His voice was low, rough, almost as if he didn't expect anyone to be here. I could hear the anger in his tone. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaky. "I was just looking for shelter from the rain. I didn't mean to intrude." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing. Then he laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was dark, almost mocking. "Shelter? This is my place, you idiot. You think you can just walk in here like you own the damn place?" His voice rose, and I could hear him stepping closer. I stood up, my hands raised. "I swear, I didn't know it was yours. I just needed to get out of the rain." He didn't respond. I could hear his heavy footsteps now, moving across the floor. I could feel his presence coming closer, like he was circling me. I had to make a decision, stay and talk my way out of this, or bolt and risk getting caught. Before I could do anything, he was right in front of me. I backed up a step, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "You don't just come into someone's home without permission. You understand that?" he growled. I tried to pull away, but his hand wouldn't budge. His fingers dug into my skin, and I was starting to panic. I had no idea what this guy was going to do. The thought of being trapped in a cabin with an angry man out in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. "I'll leave. Just let me go," I pleaded, my voice trembling. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he seemed to relax a little. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You're not just walking out of here. Not until we've had a little chat." I was stuck. There was nowhere to go. The door was still behind him, but I didn't think I could get past him without a struggle. And there was no one around for miles. The storm was still raging outside, and the night was pitch black. If I ran, he could catch me easily. I had no choice. I needed to try and get out, somehow. But this guy wasn't going to make it easy. My mind raced for a way to calm him down, to get him to let go of my arm, but I couldn't think clearly. Every part of me screamed to just leave, but I had no idea how far the road was, how long it would take to find help. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the door creaked open again. Another figure stepped inside. This one was younger, and they looked just as drenched as the man. Their eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of sympathy. Then they quickly looked down at the floor, avoiding any eye contact. "Is everything okay?" the younger person asked, voice uncertain. The older man's grip on my arm loosened just a little, but he didn't answer right away. I used that moment to slip out of his grasp, backing away slowly. I'm leaving. I don't want any trouble. I'm just looking for shelter. Please. To my relief, the older man didn't stop me this time. His eyes were still cold, but he didn't reach for me again. He just stood there, watching as I backed toward the door. I ran out into the rain without looking back, not waiting for any kind of answer, not caring if he called after me. I kept running until I found a road, then kept walking, not stopping until I finally reached a town. I didn't stop to talk to anyone about it. I didn't want to explain what happened in that cabin, but I'll never forget it. That feeling of being trapped in a place with someone who wanted nothing more than to hurt you, and the terror of knowing there was no one around to stop him. I still wonder what would have happened if that second person hadn't shown up when they did. I still can't shake the feeling. The cold, wet air. The sound of my own breath mixed with the pounding rain. And that feeling of someone watching, someone just behind me, every step of the way. It started like any other run. I was out on my usual route, the kind of run I do when I need to clear my head. The rain had been coming down hard all day, and I wasn't about to let that stop me. I had my head up, my shoes splashing through the puddles, and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps in my ears. The world felt distant, the streets quieter than usual, the kind of night where everything seems muffled by the storm. It wasn't until I was about halfway through that I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the noise of the rain, maybe some stray footsteps from someone else running nearby. But then I realized. The footsteps were too close, too in sync with mine. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't stop. Every time I picked up the pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. Every time I slowed down, they slowed too. I glanced over my shoulder once, quickly, just to see if anyone was there. Nothing. Just the rain, the street lights reflecting off the wet pavement. But when I turned my head back, I could hear it again, the footsteps, still right behind me. I could feel my heart starting to race, the anxiety creeping up in my chest. Who would be out here in this weather, running so close? I sped up, thinking maybe I was just paranoid, but they kept matching my pace. The sound of those steps, heavy, deliberate, was starting to make my skin crawl. I had to stop. I needed to see who it was, to confront them. If someone was behind me, they were clearly following me, and I wasn't about to be caught unaware. I turned sharply to the side, slipping slightly on the wet pavement as I came to a stop, but still keeping my eyes on the street behind me. My breath was coming out in clouds, but I couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop listening. For a moment, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. The rain kept falling, louder now, the only sound in the empty street. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were closer. I tensed, standing there in the rain, just waiting. My nerves were shot, every muscle in my body screaming for me to either run or confront whoever it was. I chose to turn around and face whatever was coming. And there he was. A man, just a few feet away, standing in the rain, looking at me with this intense, unsettling stare. I couldn't see much of his face. He had a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, the fabric soaked through. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, but I could tell his posture was stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "You following me?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt the tension between us building, something in the air thickening with the promise of something bad. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my legs starting to shake. But I wasn't about to let him see that. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You're in my way." I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't know if he was talking about the street or something else, but his tone was all wrong. There was no reason for him to be this close, this intense. I didn't know if he was threatening me or just crazy, but I knew I had to get out of there. I took a step back, trying to put some space between us. "I'm just running. I don't want any trouble," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could, though inside, I was panicking. The man didn't move. He just stood there, still staring at me. And then, before I could even think, he took a step forward. It was sudden, fast, and without warning. I froze, my feet rooted to the wet pavement. "What do you want?" I demanded, louder now, more desperate. I had to keep control. I had to. I wasn't about to get caught in this situation. But as I stepped back again, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm not done with you," he said, each word dripping with something dark, something threatening. I turned and ran. I didn't think about it, didn't hesitate for a second. I bolted down the street, heart pounding in my chest, every step faster than the last. The sound of the rain in my ears, the sloshing of my shoes in the puddles, none of it mattered. I couldn't hear anything but my own frantic breath and those footsteps, now echoing in time with mine. He was still behind me. I could hear him gaining on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could feel his presence, like he was inches away, waiting for the right moment to grab me. The rain was coming down harder now, a blur of water, and I could barely see. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I had no idea what this man wanted or how far he was willing to go. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, hoping he would just give up and turn away. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there. Closer now. I didn't know what he would do when he caught me. I didn't want to find out. I spotted a row of houses up ahead, the lights from the windows offering a glimmer of safety. I pushed myself harder, pumping my legs, not daring to slow down. I was almost there. I was almost safe. Then, just as I reached the sidewalk near the houses, the footsteps stopped. The sound of them, the heavy, deliberate steps, just cut off. For a second, I thought maybe he had given up. I didn't want to risk looking back, but something told me that it was too quiet now. Too still. I slowed my pace, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, the anxiety still crawling under my skin, the feeling of being hunted lingering in the air. And just as I was about to turn the corner, I heard the voice again. Low. Menacing. "You can't run forever." I didn't stop running until I was inside the first house I found, knocking frantically on the door, not even caring if I looked crazy. When the door opened, I practically collapsed, still shaking, still drenched from the rain. The woman who answered looked at me in confusion, but when I explained what had happened, she let me in without a word. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the night, but I did. I never saw the man again. But I can't stop thinking about him, about the way he followed me, about the way he spoke, like it wasn't just about running anymore. I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or if he had something worse planned. But the whole night feels like a blur, just the sound of rain and footsteps, and his voice. I haven't gone for a run since. We'd been driving for hours when the storm hit. The kind of rain that makes it hard to see anything beyond a few feet in front of you, and the wind that howled like it was angry at the world. My partner, Sarah, was behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to keep the car steady on the slick, winding road. I could tell she was getting frustrated with the rain, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it worse. It wasn't like we were in a rush or anything. We'd been taking the scenic route, trying to avoid the crowded highways, but now it felt like we were completely alone out here. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick woods on both sides, and there was nothing around for miles, no signs of life, no houses, no other cars. The occasional flash of lightning lit up the sky, but even that felt like it was miles away, swallowed by the storm. The rain was pouring down so hard that the wipers couldn't keep up, and the road was barely visible. I kept glancing at the side of the road, just trying to make out anything. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of debris, but as we got closer, I realized it was a makeshift roadblock. A bunch of thick branches and logs were piled up across the road, blocking our way completely. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, and I felt my stomach twist. "Sarah, stop the car," I said, my voice tight. "There's something in the road." She didn't need me to tell her twice. She slammed the brakes, and we came to a screeching halt. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and all I could hear was the pounding of it on the roof of the car. "Are you sure it's just debris?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Doesn't look like it." "Someone put it there on purpose," I said, my heart racing a little faster. "We should check it out." She didn't say anything. I could tell she was already getting anxious, but she pulled the car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. We both sat there for a second, staring out into the storm. "Stay in the car," Sarah said finally. "I'll go see if I can move it." I opened my mouth to protest, but she was already getting out, her door slamming shut behind her. I sat there for a moment, watching her, hoping she'd be okay. The rain made it hard to see much more than a few feet ahead, and the storm was only getting worse. The wind was howling, and it felt like the whole world was coming apart. I was already regretting suggesting we stop. I looked out the window and watched Sarah walk toward the roadblock. She had her coat pulled tightly around her, her head down to shield herself from the rain, and I could barely see her through the sheets of water coming down. I noticed her pause when she reached the logs, bending down to try to move one of the branches out of the way. But something didn't sit right with me. It was too quiet. No other cars had passed, and there was no one else around. I opened the door, just slightly, to get a better look. And that's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound. A few quick, muffled footsteps in the wet grass behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. It was so quiet for a moment that I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then I heard the sound again, closer this time. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the area, but there was no one there. Just the thick shadows cast by the trees, the rain, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating everything for a second before it went dark again. I should have stayed in the car, but something made me get out. I stepped into the rain, pulling my jacket tighter around me. I was about to call out to Sarah when I saw her standing there, motionless, staring into the trees. Her back was to me, and she didn't seem to notice that I'd gotten out. I felt a sharp tug of fear in my chest. Something was wrong. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaking a little. She didn't answer. I took a step closer, trying to ignore the cold feeling creeping up my spine. I wanted to call out again, but before I could, I heard the noise. Not from Sarah. From behind me. A low voice, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. What are you doing here? I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. The trees swayed violently in the wind, the rain coming down in sheets, but no one stepped out from the shadows. I was sure I had heard something. Someone. I turned back to Sarah, my eyes scanning the area around her. And then I saw them. Two figures emerging from the trees, their silhouettes barely visible in the rain. At first, I thought they were just shadows, but as they got closer, I could see them more clearly. Two men, wearing dark raincoats, their faces hidden by hoods. They didn't seem to be in any hurry, just slowly walking toward us. "Sarah!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Get back to the car." But she didn't hear me. She just stood there, staring ahead, her face pale. The two men were almost to us now, and I could see the faint glint of something shiny in their hands, a knife, maybe, or something else. I couldn't tell. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. These weren't just people looking for help. I had no idea who they were, but I knew they weren't friendly. The first man spoke again, his voice low, dangerous. "We don't like people wandering through here." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you want?" "We're just passing through. We don't want any trouble." "Too bad," the second man said, his voice cold. "You should have stayed on the main road." My mind was screaming at me to run. But there was no way I could leave Sarah here. I had to get her back to the car. I looked around quickly, trying to find some way out, but I couldn't see anything. We were too far from help. The storm made everything disorienting. The men were closing in now, and I had no idea what they were planning to do. The first man raised his hand, and that's when I saw the knife. The glint of steel in the low light of the storm. I grabbed Sarah's arm as hard as I could, yanking her toward the car. "Get in the car. Now!" She didn't resist, but she looked confused, like she couldn't understand what was happening. I pulled her with me, her feet slipping in the wet mud, and we both tumbled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking, and I started the engine. The two men were still standing at the roadblock, watching us. They didn't move, but they didn't look away either. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the wet ground, but I finally got enough traction to back up. I didn't even check the mirrors, just slammed it into drive and sped down the road. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, and even then, I don't think we ever really felt safe. I don't know what those men wanted, or why they decided to trap us there, but I'm just glad we got out. I never want to be that far off the beaten path again. And I sure as hell never want to come across a roadblock in the middle of nowhere, not knowing who's behind it. The storm passed, but the fear didn't. It was late. The kind of late when the world feels empty, like everyone else has already gone home for the night, leaving you to deal with things on your own. The rain was coming down in torrents, so thick it felt like the sky was going to swallow the whole road. The windshield wipers could barely keep up with it, and the headlights of my car seemed useless, cutting through the rain only a few feet ahead. I wasn't in a rush, just trying to get home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was messing with my head. I was about 10 miles from the nearest town, on a long, dark stretch of road that was mostly trees on either side. I'd passed a few houses earlier, but now there was nothing. No lights, no signs of life. Just trees, rain, and the occasional flash of lightning that made everything look worse. My headlights caught something in the distance, and for a second, I thought it was just another reflection from the rain. But then I saw it again, movement on the side of the road. A figure. At first, I thought it might be someone walking, but then I noticed something strange. The figure was hunched over, and as I got closer, I realized it was a child. The kid was standing there, drenched, just standing still, staring down at the pavement. My heart rate picked up. The whole situation felt wrong. What was a child doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, in this kind of storm? I slowed the car, not sure what I was going to do. I wasn't the kind of person to ignore someone in need, but there was something unsettling about the whole thing. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires skidding a little as I parked. The rain was so loud that I could barely hear anything else. I cracked the window, trying to make out any details. The child looked to be maybe 6 or 7, standing there in soaked clothes, shivering. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely above the noise of the storm. The child didn't answer. He just kept standing there, his head down, his back to me. My gut twisted. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was fine. Maybe the kid was lost or had been left behind by someone. But why was he out here alone in this mess? I opened the door and stepped out into the rain, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I approached the child. "Hey, buddy, are you lost? Where are your parents?" The kid didn't move. He just kept standing there. I took another step forward, my shoes squishing in the wet gravel, my hands outstretched. "Hey, are you okay?" That's when I saw it. The kid's hands were covered in something dirt, maybe? It didn't seem right. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, like this wasn't just some lost kid. I reached out to touch his shoulder, gently, just to make sure he wasn't hurt, when suddenly he turned, snapping his head up with a sharp, fast movement. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face was covered in mud, streaked with rain, and he was crying, but there was something in the way he looked at me, like it was rehearsed. A part of me froze, unsure whether I should pull back or keep going. "Are you okay?" I asked again, my voice shaking a little. He didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at me, his eyes still wide. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps coming from behind me. They were too close, too fast. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The road was empty. Just rain, trees, and the sound of the storm. But the feeling of being watched, it was there. It was like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. The kid finally spoke, his voice shaky and soft, like he had to force the words out. "Help me," he whispered. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me. "Where are your parents?" I asked, my voice tight, my mind racing. I was trying to make sense of this, trying to figure out if I was just being paranoid, but everything about the situation felt wrong. I could feel the presence of someone, hidden in the shadows, waiting. I was sure of it. And then I saw him. A man stepped out from behind a tree, just a few yards away, his face half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, wearing a rain-soaked coat, and his eyes were fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. He didn't say anything, just watched me. The way he stood there, not moving, it felt like he had been there the whole time. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking as I took another step back. I was looking between the kid and the man, trying to make sense of it, but my thoughts were jumbled. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there. I could feel my heart racing, my hands trembling. "Help him," the man said, his voice too calm, too even, as he took a step forward. I looked down at the kid, still standing there, his head slightly tilted, still crying, his hands shaking. But something about his face, it wasn't right. He wasn't acting like a scared child. He was playing a part. And the man, he wasn't acting like a parent or someone worried about a child. He was too calm, too composed. I turned toward the car, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my body didn't want to listen. "Stay away from me," I shouted, finally finding my voice, but the words barely made it out. My breath was shallow, my head spinning. I was already backing away, taking slow, careful steps toward the car. I didn't dare take my eyes off the man, not for a second. He was still watching me, not saying anything, just standing there. I reached the door, fumbling for the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could feel them. Both of them. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. I got the door open, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, and I hit the gas, my tires screeching on the wet road. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I don't think I really felt safe. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, like something was lurking just out of sight. I never saw the kid or the man again. But I can't shake the feeling that they were waiting for someone else, that they had done this before, and that I was just lucky enough to escape. It doesn't matter how many times I try to reason with myself. I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I'll never forget the look in the kid's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something worse. It was supposed to be a normal evening. I had just gotten off work, the rain was coming down heavy, and I was in a rush to get home. I don't even remember why, but I needed to get out of there quickly. I had parked at the bottom of a steep hill in the city, right near an old apartment building with this narrow, slippery staircase leading up to the street. The kind of staircase you walk down when you're rushing, hoping not to slip and fall. I wasn't paying enough attention, honestly. My mind was all over the place, thinking about work, about the drive home, about what I still had to do. It was dark, the street lamps were flickering in the rain, and I couldn't even see clearly. I stepped onto the first stair, and that's when I felt the slickness beneath my foot. Before I knew it, my foot shot out from under me. I tried to catch myself, but the next thing I knew, I was tumbling down the rest of the stairs. My body hit every step like a sack of potatoes. I heard the sickening thud of my head hitting the stone, the way it bounced off the wet steps. My arms and legs felt like they were made of rubber, and I was too disoriented to make sense of what was happening. I think I lost consciousness for a second. I remember seeing flashes of light and hearing distant noises before everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my back, soaked from head to toe, the cold rain splashing in my face. I could barely move. My whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. The taste of blood was in my mouth, and I couldn't remember where I was or how long I'd been out. My head was pounding. Slowly, I blinked a few times, trying to focus. That's when I noticed them. There were people standing around me, looking down at me. I tried to lift my head, but my neck was stiff, and I could barely keep my eyes open. They weren't rushing to help me. They weren't even concerned about the fact that I had just fallen down the stairs and might be seriously hurt. They just stared at me. The first thing I noticed was the guy closest to me. He was wearing a rain-soaked jacket, his hood pulled up over his head. His face was partially hidden, but I could see his eyes were darting around nervously, like he was expecting something or someone to show up. There were two others standing behind him, one tall and thin, the other short with a thick coat. Neither of them said anything, but they were watching me intently. The guy closest to me kneeled down. "Hey, you all right?" His voice wasn't kind. It wasn't concerned. It was flat, almost bored. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt numb, like I was drunk. I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there, unable to move, feeling the cold rain against my skin and the pain in my head. The guy didn't seem to care. He reached into my pocket without warning, and before I could even react, he pulled out my wallet. I tried to sit up. My body screamed at me to stop, but I pushed through the pain, my head spinning, trying to focus on what was happening. "Hey," I managed to croak, "give it back." The guy didn't even look up at me. He opened my wallet and started flipping through it. I could barely see, but I noticed my credit cards, my ID, everything. My breath was shallow. I knew something wasn't right. These people weren't here to help me. They didn't care about the fact that I had just fallen down a flight of stairs in the rain. They cared about my wallet. "Hey," I said, "give it back," I repeated, my voice shaking with anger and fear. My fingers were still stiff, but I managed to move one hand, weakly reaching out to grab my wallet. The tall guy behind him, who hadn't spoken a word until then, stepped forward. He had a sharp look in his eyes, and his face was completely expressionless. He reached out, pushing my hand away with a little more force than I expected. "Stay down," he said, his voice cold. I tried to protest, but my head throbbed, and the world spun around me. Everything felt distant, like I wasn't even in my own body. I just kept watching them, struggling to make sense of what was happening. They weren't trying to help. They weren't trying to call for an ambulance or ask if I was okay. They were just waiting, watching me suffer. The guy with my wallet, who had been rifling through it, suddenly pulled out my cash. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I saw him slide the bills into his jacket pocket with a sly grin on his face. Then, he dropped the wallet back onto my chest like it was nothing. "You should have been more careful," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not a good idea to be out here all alone in the rain, huh?" I couldn't believe what was happening. I tried to push myself up, but I was still too disoriented. My arms were shaking. I wanted to fight back, but my body wasn't working right. My legs felt like they were made of stone. All I could do was watch them. The tall guy crouched next to me, looking down at me with a strange expression. I couldn't tell if he was amused or annoyed. "You should just stay still," he said, his voice low. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The short guy, who had been standing quietly until then, started moving around, like he was looking for something. He went through my car, checking the doors, peering inside like he was searching for more things to steal. The rain was coming down harder now, but these guys didn't seem to care at all. I was terrified, feeling helpless and trapped. There were 3 of them, and I was alone on this dark, rainy street, barely able to move. I couldn't think straight, but I knew I had to get away, somehow. I had to make it stop. I started shouting, my voice cracking. "Call the police." I screamed, but it came out as barely a whisper. They just looked at each other, like they were deciding what to do with me next. My heart raced, and panic began to set in. Finally, the guy who had been rummaging through my stuff stood up. He took one last look at me before stepping back, pulling something out of his pocket. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I saw the glint of a knife, my stomach turned. I didn't know if he was going to use it on me or just threaten me, but I didn't want to find out. I heard the man mutter something, but it was lost in the roar of the rain. I couldn't stay there. I had to get up. I had to move. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself off the wet ground. My legs were still weak, but I stumbled, managing to get to my feet. They watched me, but none of them moved. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I backed up, slowly, toward my car. They didn't stop me. I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking as I unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, my hands still trembling, and I sped off without looking back. I don't know why they didn't follow me, or why they didn't do anything else, but I didn't stop until I was out of that area and into the nearest gas station, where I stayed inside, my hands still shaking. I'm still not sure what they wanted. All I know is they weren't there to help me. They just wanted my wallet. It started out like a dream. I was living in a small town, fresh out of college, and I was desperate to find a place of my own. I didn't have a lot of money saved up, and the cost of living was more than I could afford, so when I saw the listing for a one-bedroom apartment in a good area at an unbelievably low price, I thought I hit the jackpot. The apartment was charming in its own way, old, but clean. It had hardwood floors, high ceilings, and huge windows that let in a lot of natural light. It wasn't big, but it was perfect for me. I was so excited. I reached out to the landlord right away. His name was Mr. Adams, an older man who seemed nice enough over the phone. He said he'd been renting out the place for years and had recently lowered the rent because he was trying to find a reliable tenant. The deal was too good to pass up, and after meeting him in person, I signed the lease without hesitation. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I unpacked my things, arranged my furniture, and settled into my new home. Mr. Adams would stop by occasionally to check in, but it always seemed like he was just making sure everything was going smoothly. He never came inside, just knocked on the door, asked if everything was fine, and left. I didn't think anything of it. It wasn't unusual for landlords to check in on their tenants every once in a while. But then I started noticing small things. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but the more I noticed, the more it started to feel like something was off. The apartment was old, and there were a few creaky spots on the floor, but every now and then, I'd hear a sound, like someone shifting in the next room, or the faint click of a door opening. I assumed it was just the building settling, or maybe even the neighbors. But then, I started to catch glimpses of things that didn't make sense. One evening, I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I got up to get a drink from the kitchen. I passed by the hallway mirror, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. There was a small black dot on the ceiling near the light fixture. It wasn't noticeable unless you were really looking, but it caught my attention. I thought it might be a speck of dust, so I grabbed a broom to reach it. But when I got close enough, I realized it was a tiny black camera lens, almost hidden against the white paint. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood there staring at it. My mind raced. Maybe it was an old camera from when the place was renovated, I thought. Maybe it had something to do with the building's security system, but it felt wrong. Why would it be in the living room, pointed right where I'd be sitting? I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I decided to do some checking. I went through the apartment room by room, looking closely at every corner, every light fixture, and every possible hiding spot I could think of. It was hard to tell at first, but the more I looked, the more I found. There was another camera hidden in the smoke detector in the bedroom, and another one tucked away behind a vent in the bathroom. Each one was tiny, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was like they'd been placed in the most inconspicuous spots, but they were there, staring at me. Watching me. I felt sick. My stomach dropped, and my mind began to race. How long had they been there? How many had I missed? The worst part was, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave. I didn't have the money to find a new place on such short notice, and I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't even know if Mr. Adams was aware of the cameras or if he was involved in whatever sick thing was going on. I felt trapped. I decided to confront him. I couldn't let this go on, not without answers. The next time he knocked on my door to check in, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and asked him to come in. He seemed surprised, but he stepped inside. I didn't waste any time. I told him I had found the cameras, that I knew he had been spying on me. His face went pale, and for a moment, he just stood there, frozen. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice shaky. He tried to play it off, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. I pushed further, demanding answers, telling him that I was going to call the police. But he just kept insisting that it was all a misunderstanding. That the cameras were there for safety, to monitor the apartment while it was vacant. He kept saying I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid. He told me it was standard for all his tenants to have surveillance for their protection. I didn't believe him. It sounded like a lie, and the way he was avoiding eye contact made it even worse. I told him I was done and that I was calling the police. But before I could reach for my phone, he stepped forward quickly, blocking the door. I froze, my heart pounding. "Please, don't do that," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Just let this go. It's nothing personal." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. He was too calm, too smooth, but there was an edge to his voice that made everything feel wrong. I pushed past him, my mind racing. I wasn't going to stand there and let him talk me down. I grabbed my phone and stepped out of the apartment, calling the police as I walked down the hallway. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, Mr. Adams was gone. I showed them the cameras, the ones I had found, and the evidence was enough for them to start an investigation. They combed through the apartment and found even more hidden cameras in places I hadn't thought to check. They didn't find Mr. Adams, though. He had disappeared. I moved out that same week, and I didn't look back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always being watched, even after I left. The police never found Mr. Adams, but they told me the place had been on their radar for a while, that he'd done this before with other tenants, though they couldn't track him down for good. I still don't know what exactly he was planning or why he chose me. But I'm grateful I found the cameras when I did. I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't think I'll ever fully get over the thought of someone watching me so closely, every day, every moment. It's something that haunts me to this day. We decided to go hiking on a Friday. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just four of us, me, Danny, Claire, and Joel. The trail was tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. Joel picked it because it was supposed to have some amazing views, and we were all up for an adventure. We packed our gear, food, and tents, ready for 2 nights of camping. The first day was fine. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, with little clearings where we'd stop for water or a quick snack. We laughed, took pictures, and talked about how nice it was to be away from everything. Danny was the jokester of the group, always messing around and teasing Claire about her fear of bugs. By the time we made it to the first campsite, the sun was setting. We set up our tents, made a small fire, and ate while the sky turned dark. That night, as we sat around the fire, we thought we heard something in the woods. It was faint, like a twig snapping, but it made us all stop talking. Joel said it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The forest was too quiet. No birds, No crickets, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, Danny was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots were gone, and so was his backpack. At first, we thought he'd just gone to use the bathroom or explore, but as the hours passed, we started to worry. Joel and I searched the area, calling his name, while Claire stayed by the camp in case he came back. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear left behind, nothing. By midday, Joel suggested we pack up and head back to the car. He said maybe Danny had gotten lost and somehow found his way back to the trailhead. Claire was panicking, saying we should call for help, but our phones didn't have any signal. We agreed to hike back, figuring we could alert someone once we were closer to town. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The trail felt different on the way back, like the trees had closed in. Joel noticed it too. He kept checking the map, muttering that it didn't make sense. The path seemed longer, or maybe we were just more on edge. Then we found the first clue. A water bottle, half full, sitting on the edge of the trail. It was Danny's. He had a specific brand he always carried. Claire picked it up and started crying, saying he must have come this way. But why would he leave it behind? Joel tried to stay calm, saying it could have fallen out of his bag. An hour later, we found his bandana tied to a low branch. That was when Joel started to get nervous. "This isn't right," he said. He wouldn't just leave his stuff like this. We decided to keep moving, faster this time, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. Around dusk, we found his boot. Just one, lying in the middle of the path. The laces were still tied, but it was dirty, like it had been dragged through the mud. Claire broke down again, saying we needed to stop and wait for Danny. Joel and I argued with her, saying it was safer to keep going. We didn't want to be stuck out there another night. That was when we noticed something. The boot had marks on it, like it had been scratched or clawed at. But they weren't from an animal. They were too deliberate, too clean. Joel and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything to Claire. We just told her to keep moving. As the sun went down, we found more clues. A ripped strap from Danny's backpack, a trail of granola spilling across the dirt. Each piece felt like a breadcrumb, like someone was leading us somewhere. I started to hear things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned, the woods were empty. Joel was tense, his hand gripping the strap of his pack like he was ready to swing it at someone. We decided to stop for the night when it got too dark to see. Claire was a mess, whispering that something was wrong, that we should have stayed at the first campsite. Joel tried to reassure her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a shadow, darting between the trees. I nudged Joel, and he saw it too. We didn't wake Claire, not wanting to scare her more, but we stayed up, gripping sticks like they were weapons. The shadow didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just circled us, staying just out of reach. By dawn, we were ready to run. We packed up as quickly as we could, dragging Claire along as she sobbed. The trail was easier to follow in the daylight, but the woods felt wrong, like they were watching us. Then we found Danny's other boot. It was on the trail, facing us, like it had been placed there. Joel picked it up and froze. Inside was a piece of paper, folded tightly. He opened it, and his face went pale. I grabbed it from him and read the message. It was written in blocky, uneven letters, "You're next." That was it. We ran. We didn't care about staying quiet or conserving energy. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush when the trail twisted too much. I didn't look back, not even when I heard Claire scream. Joel stopped to help her up, but I kept going, yelling for them to hurry. We made it back to the car just as the sun was setting. The lot was empty, and Danny's car was still there, untouched. We piled into Joel's car and sped out of there, not saying a word until we hit the main road. We reported everything to the police, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Danny, no evidence on the trail. It was like he had vanished. They said it was probably an animal attack or that he'd gotten lost, but I know that's not true. Someone was out there, watching us, leading us, playing with us. And they're still out there. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a two-car garage. A couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, a couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. Maybe they forgot about the appointment. Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. "Neither am I," I replied. But I wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. I think we should check it out. What? Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. I don't know, I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but I'm not going first. We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us, or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic. Almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. We need to leave now, I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope you'd use to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. This is all wrong, I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. We need to call the police. This place it's a trap. As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. We need to get out of here, now, I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone, but the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. What the hell? The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of the house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about the house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap, or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure, we were lucky to get out of there alive. We moved into our new house in early spring. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood you'd expect to find a house like ours in, but the price was right, and the house had everything we needed. The kids were excited, and my wife, Liz, was looking forward to making a fresh start after the chaos of the past year. We'd been through a lot, moving to a new town, settling into a new job, all that, but it felt like this could be a new chapter for us. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, and the kids quickly made friends with some of the other children in the area. Liz met a few of the local moms, and they were eager to have her over for coffee. It felt like the kind of place where people looked out for each other, which was exactly what we needed. But there was one neighbor, the one next door, who gave me a bad feeling from the start. His name was Doug. He lived alone, which I didn't think much of at first, but there was something unsettling about him. He always seemed to be watching us, even when we weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. The first time we met him, he just walked across the yard to introduce himself, but he stood there too long, staring at me and Liz with this strange smile. I chalked it up to being awkward, but it stuck with me. At first, it wasn't anything major. Just small things. He'd wave from his porch, but then stand there staring while we got the kids into the car. He'd be outside when I came home from work, as if he had been waiting for me to pull into the driveway. He'd strike up these long, drawn-out conversations about the weather, or the neighborhood, or whatever. I tried to be polite, but it was like he was trying too hard to insert himself into our lives. Liz started to notice it too. She'd mention how strange it was that Doug seemed to always be home whenever we were, like he was watching for when we'd come outside. She made a joke about it at first, but then she started to get uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. It wasn't until about a month into living there that the weirdness really started. One evening, Liz and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The kids were upstairs, and the house was quiet. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a shadow in the front yard. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but when I looked out the window, I saw Doug standing in his driveway, staring directly at our house. I thought it was odd, but maybe he was just taking a walk or something. I told Liz, and she didn't think much of it either. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I went outside to check the mail, and Doug came over. He didn't even wait for me to come up to him. He just started talking, asking about the house and how we liked it. I gave him short answers, but he kept going on, telling me things about the neighborhood, about the previous owners of the house, about how quiet it was here. But he wasn't looking at me when he spoke. His eyes were darting around, like he was checking for something or someone. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I just nodded along. Things took a darker turn the following week. Liz and I were getting ready to go out for a date night. We had hired a sitter, and everything was set. But when I went out to start the car, I noticed something strange. Doug's garage door was open, and his car was parked inside, but the lights in his house were off. The windows were completely dark. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned around to get into my car, I saw Doug standing in his driveway again, staring at me. I got this chill down my spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. He was looking at me with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. It was like he was watching, waiting. I rushed to the car, locked the doors, and started it up. I didn't say anything to Liz right away, but I felt the tension in the air as I drove out of the driveway. It was like Doug was waiting for something, like he had been anticipating my every move. I brushed it off as paranoia. We went out, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night when we came home, the house was quiet, but something felt off. Liz mentioned it first. "Did you leave the porch light on?" she asked. I hadn't. I checked, and sure enough, the light was on. I went outside to turn it off and noticed that the gate to our backyard was slightly open, even though we had locked it earlier. I had no idea how it had happened, but that was when I realized something wasn't right. Doug had been at the center of everything. I couldn't prove it, but the sense of being watched was growing stronger each day. Liz noticed things too. Small things, like her gardening tools being moved, or our front door slightly ajar when we were sure we'd locked it. I started checking the windows and doors every night before bed, but it felt like no matter how careful we were, someone was always a step ahead of us. It came to a head a week later. I was home alone one afternoon, working from my office. I got up to make coffee, and as I passed by the window, I saw Doug standing on the edge of his porch, staring at me through the window. I froze, but he didn't move. He just kept watching, as if waiting for me to notice him. I pulled the blinds down quickly and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called Liz, but she didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I didn't have to look to know it was him. I could feel it. My blood ran cold as I heard Doug's voice, muffled through the door. "You're home alone, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost playful. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a lamp, and I stood still, listening. The door handle rattled, and I could hear Doug's voice again. "I know you're there. I've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, but all I could think was to get out of the house. I ran upstairs and grabbed the kids, told them to stay quiet and hide in the closet. I didn't know if Doug had any intention of harming us, but I wasn't going to risk finding out. I called the police, my hands shaking, and within minutes, I heard their sirens. When they arrived, Doug was gone. They searched the property and surrounding areas, but there was no sign of him. They told me there was nothing they could do unless we had concrete evidence of harassment or a threat, and without that, they couldn't press charges. We moved out within the week. I didn't feel safe anymore, and neither did Liz. I don't know what Doug wanted, but I couldn't stick around to find out. After we left, I found out from a neighbor that Doug had lived alone for years and had a history of bizarre behavior. Apparently, he didn't like new neighbors moving in. They said he'd been trying to get the house next door to ours for a long time. I'll never understand why he acted the way he did, but I'm just glad we got out. Every time I think back to that house, to Doug, I can't help but feel like we narrowly escaped something much worse. It was a job like any other, or at least that's how I thought it would be. The call came through on a Tuesday afternoon. The man on the other end sounded polite enough, though his voice had a certain edge to it. He told me he needed someone to fix a few things around his house, some broken windows, a door that wouldn't latch properly, and a couple of minor things here and there. He said the house was remote, out by the woods. He asked if I could come by the next morning. I told him it'd be no problem. The pay was good, and it sounded like a simple enough task. I had no idea how wrong I was. I arrived at the house around 9 a.m. the next day. It was the kind of house that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but not in a charming, old house way. The yard was overgrown, the paint chipped, and the windows were grimy, half covered in dirt and grime. The air around the house felt still, like no one had been there in a long time. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time. After a few moments, I heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, and there he was. The man didn't look like much. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, tall but thin, with a rough face that seemed to have seen its share of hard days. His eyes were too intense, though. They looked like they were watching me more than they were looking at me. He didn't smile, just nodded and said, "You're here for the repairs?" I nodded, feeling a slight unease, but brushed it off. "Yep, that's me. You mentioned a few things around the house that need fixing?" He stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. Right. Just a few things. I'll show you around." As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, it was too quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. It was cold too, and not in the normal old house way. There was no warmth to the place, no life, just the smell of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. He led me through the house, showing me the various spots that needed attention. I didn't ask too many questions. I've been doing this long enough to know that not everyone wants to talk during repairs, and I didn't think much of it. I was just there to get the job done and move on. We went into the back room where the broken windows were. I started looking over the damage, getting my tools ready. The man stood by the door, watching me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my neck, and it was starting to bother me. "You okay?" I asked, trying to make some small talk. He didn't answer right away. Just stood there, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "You'll be here a while, won't you?" I paused. "Maybe a few hours, yeah. I'll fix up the windows, then move on to the door. It shouldn't take long." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, slowly, and stood there in silence while I worked. The more I worked, the more I started feeling like something was off. It wasn't just the house, though the house was unsettling enough. It was the way he acted, like he was waiting for something, or maybe watching for something. I tried to shake off the feeling. I was here to do a job. That was it. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Around noon, I took a break to grab my water bottle and check my phone. No service, as I expected. The house was too far out for any signal to get through. I glanced around the room, and I saw that he had been standing at the door watching me the whole time. I caught his eye, and he didn't look away. It was unsettling. "You need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said, but his voice sounded strange, distant. "Just making sure you're doing it right." I nodded but didn't say anything. It was weird, but I kept working. I finished up the windows and moved on to the door, fixing the latch. It wasn't difficult work, but it felt like it was taking longer than usual. The tension in the house was growing, and it was harder to focus with each minute that passed. I finished with the door and turned to look at him. He was standing in the same spot by the door. He hadn't moved an inch. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sense that something wasn't right. I'd been alone in a lot of houses before, but never one that felt so suffocating. "All right, I think that's everything," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "You'll want to check the windows and the door, make sure everything's working." He didn't move. "You're not done yet," he said quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've done everything you asked for." His face changed then, just slightly. His eyes seemed to narrow, and he took a step forward, blocking the door. "No, you're not leaving," he said, his voice suddenly colder. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "I've fixed everything. I'm done. I need to go." "You're not done," he repeated. "You're not leaving." I realized then that the door behind him had been locked. I didn't know when it had happened, but it was locked now. The whole atmosphere in the room shifted. My pulse quickened. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He pulled out a small key from his pocket, turned it in the lock, and opened the door just enough to slip through. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I wasn't sure how far I could get. I knew the woods were out back, but they were miles away, and I had no idea how to get out of the house. "I'm going to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. The man's expression didn't change. "No need for that," he said. "You'll stay here for a while. I've got a few more jobs for you." I knew right then that something wasn't right. The whole situation felt wrong in a way that I couldn't explain. This wasn't just about repairs. It was about something else, something I didn't understand. I kept my distance, trying to come up with a plan. I looked around the room for anything I could use. That's when I noticed the windows had been sealed shut, the kind of seal that couldn't be easily undone. I was trapped, and he was not letting me leave. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to think of a way out. Finally, after what felt like hours, he started to walk toward me. I backed away, and just as he was about to get too close, I lunged for the window. I don't know how, but I broke the seal and managed to pull it open just enough to climb through. I ran as fast as I could into the woods, not looking back, not stopping for anything. I kept running until I finally found a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was kind enough to take me back to the nearest town. I never went back to that house. I never contacted the man again. And every time I think about it, I can still feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know what he wanted, but I don't care to find out. I got out. I was lucky. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a small group of us heading out to the woods for some camping. We were a tight-knit group, 4 friends who had been hanging out together since college. The plan was to hike, set up camp, and just enjoy the quiet of the forest. No phones, no distractions, just us in nature. We had been hiking for a few hours, making our way along an unfamiliar trail we found on a map. The weather had been nice, the kind of cold breeze that makes the woods smell fresh. There wasn't much talk as we walked, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional laugh about something stupid. We all agreed that this was the kind of trip we needed, peaceful and undisturbed. Then we came across the cabin. It wasn't marked on the trail map, which was odd. It wasn't even in good condition. The roof was sagging in some places, and there were a few windows that were boarded up, but there was no mistaking it. This place had been abandoned for a while. There was no road leading to it, no signs of people around, just trees and silence. At first, we all thought it was just an old hunting cabin or maybe some kind of relic from years ago. It wasn't uncommon to find these kinds of things when you ventured into the woods. But then, we noticed something strange. There was a new, fresh-looking trail of footprints leading up to the porch. It wasn't a large set, just a single pair of boots, maybe a man's, making their way in and out of the cabin. I don't know why, but none of us decided to turn around right then. Instead, we stood there for a few moments, looking at each other. It was like we all had the same idea, that we should check it out. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because we were tired and the cabin looked like a perfect place to rest for a while. Whatever it was, we moved closer. As we approached, the creaky wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, and one of the boards nearly snapped. The air around the cabin felt colder, but it wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a shift in temperature. It was more of an uncomfortable chill that seemed to seep into your bones. We joked about it at first, saying it was just the old cabin giving off strange vibes, but there was something about it that felt wrong. We knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But when no one responded, we opened it slowly, half expecting the hinges to squeak, but it didn't. It was a soft, almost deliberate creak. The inside was dark, dust settling on the furniture and wooden floors. The place looked abandoned for sure, but there was something that didn't sit right. There was an odd smell, a mix of stale air and something earthy, like wet dirt. The furniture was sparse, an old couch covered in a gray sheet, a coffee table with some old magazines, a chair near the window that looked out toward the trees. It was empty, except for one detail, a backpack sitting on the floor, near the door. It was open, as though someone had just been there and left in a hurry. We all stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, but I didn't want to be the first to admit that something felt off. Then one of my friends, Chris, picked up the backpack. He opened it, rummaging through the contents. "Hey, check this out," he said. We all crowded around. Inside the bag, there were a few sets of clothes, a flashlight, a couple of water bottles, and what looked like a few empty cans of food. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. Tucked in between the cans was a thick rope, and next to that, a half-empty bottle of something that smelled like alcohol. Chris pulled his hand back quickly, and for the first time, we all looked at each other with a shared realization this wasn't just an abandoned cabin. Someone had been living here, recently. It was all too recent. "I think we should leave," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaking. She was usually the most adventurous of us, always the one encouraging us to take risks. But now, even she looked unnerved. We didn't argue. We quickly made our way back to the door, but when we got to the porch, we heard something, a faint sound from the woods behind the cabin. A snap of a twig, followed by a slow, steady footstep. We froze. I didn't even have to look at the others to know they were thinking the same thing. Someone was out there, and they knew we were here. "Let's go." "Now," I said, my voice a little too sharp. We turned to leave, but then the door to the cabin slammed shut behind us, like it had been pushed by an invisible hand. Everyone jumped. We ran down the stairs, and as we rounded the corner of the cabin, we saw a figure standing in the woods, just out of reach of the trees. It was too dark to make out his face, but his figure was unmistakable, tall, with a dark jacket and what looked like a pair of boots. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or one of the others, but we didn't waste a second. We ran in the opposite direction, towards the trees, not even looking back to see if he was following. We didn't need to. The sounds of the footsteps behind us were enough to make us push harder, faster. We didn't stop until we reached the trail again, and even then, we kept running. We didn't speak to each other at first, just breathing heavily, but eventually, when we stopped to catch our breath, we realized how close we had been to something terrible. We made it back to the car without further incident. As we drove away, none of us said much. I think we were all too shaken, too scared to speak about what had just happened. The cabin, the backpack, the figure in the woods, it didn't make sense. But we all knew one thing, someone had been living there, and they weren't far away. I don't know who they were, or what they intended to do, but I'll never forget the look in the man's eyes, the same kind of coldness that made my blood run cold. I'm just thankful we made it out alive. And I'll never go camping again without wondering if someone's watching me from the woods.